Okay. Oh, I gotta do this. Okay. Hello and welcome to episode 99 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa. And we got lots of questions. We got a merciless onslaught of questions today. More than 50 of them. So it's going to take a while, I think, to say the least. And I guess I should say that next weekend probably will be Q&A number 100, and the plan is to do a live stream. So I'll probably be doing this live like next Sunday at noon my time, which is Eastern time, like the same as New York time, except I'm not in New York. So again, so long as the next one I do is 100, which is now kind of thrown into question because scientists have discovered a new number called Bleen, which lies in between 6 and 7. So if that's the case, then the next Q&A would be like number 91 or something. So, I mean, so long as the way counting works doesn't change, then next weekend will be number 100, and I'll be doing it live at noon on Sunday. Inshallah, the gods willing. So, I guess I should just start answering questions. And the first question is from the proto-pseudo-monk. And he has titles to his questions sometimes. So the first title is on celibacy and defensive strategies. So the proto-pseudo-monk says, I recall at one point you mentioned being... No, he didn't say that. He said, I recall at one point you mentioned using military tactics of retreating, defense instead of offense as making progress. In what manner is spanking the puppy beneficial? In contrast to celibacy being counterproductive, without TMI, I have generally found two causes. One seems to be of biological nature, simply after a long time it builds up, you have said, like a shotgun. And two, due to a sense impression, seeing a woman, meeting and chatting with a woman, etc. My personal strategy for keeping the 8 precepts is to avoid anything beyond spanking the puppy, because I think actual sex with a woman causes orders of magnitude more attachment and delusion. The main reason is that endless fantasizing seems like a more distressed mental state than a minor indulgence that actually makes you think, I'm messed up, there's a lot of work to do, I need to meditate more. I find that from the post-nut clarity vantage point, the pursuit of sex immediately seems meaningless, useless, and will inevitably cause suffering as you see the muddled mind states of the addict. But whilst in society, it seems like a desire that will always persist. My only real success with celibacy was in total solitude. Advice on celibacy ? Well, now I scroll back up to the top of this question, and he does say something that's not entirely accurate here. Let's see. He says he recalls at one point that I mentioned using military tactics of retreating, defense instead of offense as making progress. Well, that's not exactly what I was saying. It's more a flexible defense rather than a rigid defense. And I remember reading in a book on military strategy that was discussing, like, among other things, World War II, and how Hitler was insisting on the Eastern Front not to give up 1 inch of ground. He forced his generals to maintain a totally rigid defense and not withdraw, not retreat 1 foot. And some of his generals were begging him, please just let us do a flexible defense. Then we can like lure the enemy into traps, or, just wait for them to be vulnerable and then make a counterattack, that sort of thing. But he wouldn't do it. So that was the point I was making, that sometimes you do have to retreat a little bit in order to avoid losing the war. So then he's got 2 question marks. One is, in what manner is spanking the puppy beneficial? And the other one is at the bottom here. Advice on celibacy ? Well, I did write a rather long 2-part blog post long ago, which I think is incorporated into my book, Buddhist Ethics, Buddhist Practice. Maybe I should check first and make sure. Is the book up here? Yeah, just a second here. Let's see here. I just want to make sure that I'm not false advertising or anything. See, on Lust and Celibacy. Yeah, it's here. Page 40 in this book, which you can buy off Amazon. So that would be my long, detailed discussion on celibacy and the difficulties of celibacy, and what's the point and what maybe isn't the point and all that. But I'll give a short answer here, mainly because we got a merciless onslaught of questions. So, yeah, I mean, you can use masturbation as a kind of pressure relief valve. Although if you don't use it as a pressure relief valve, if you're young and dumb and full of precious bodily fluids and so forth, that, it'll just happen spontaneously in your sleep. So as a monk, when I was a young monk, up until I was in my early to mid 40s, I would have just a nocturnal emission about every 2 weeks. At least every 2 weeks. So it's not like you're going to explode from internal pressure or anything, that there is just a natural pressure release mechanism that goes on. But it is true, when the proto-pseudo-monk says that when he's from the post-nut clarity vantage point, the pursuit of sex immediately seems meaningless, useless, and will inevitably cause suffering as you see the muddled mind states of the addict. Well, yeah, the purpose of sex, there's two main purposes of sex in human beings. Well, two main biological purposes, let's say. The main reason is it feels really good, but the reason why it feels really good is you got two evolutionary reasons or biological reasons. One, of course, is to make babies, to reproduce your DNA sequences. And the second is to strengthen a pair bond with your mate, ultimately for the purpose of, having babies and reproducing your DNA sequences, or at least increasing the odds of that. So if neither one of those is really a priority for you, it's not on your list of things to do, then I think celibacy, it's certainly praised in Buddhism, especially Theravada Buddhism. In Theravada Buddhism, it's pretty much mandatory if you want to become enlightened. Although there is a certain amount of ancient Indian cultural conditioning that has been incorporated into early Buddhism. So I do think it is theoretically possible for a person who is not celibate to become enlightened, although it is more difficult. It's definitely a higher difficulty setting. So, advice on celibacy, if you can do it, go ahead and do it. It's like the New Testament, where Jesus says there are three kinds of eunuchs: those who are born eunuchs, those who are made eunuchs, and those who become eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And the third kind is people who are celibate for spiritual reasons. And then right after that, Jesus says it's not for everybody. So, if you can do it and you think that's the right thing to do, then you should go ahead and do it. In which case, it may be a certain amount of spanking the puppy, maybe like the lesser of two evils, so to speak. Not that not that playing with yourself is literally evil, but it might be better than just being horny all the time and climbing the walls and perving on every attractive woman you see, that sort of thing. Because it really, it's just built into us humans, some more than others. And there are times you can just be wanting to cry or howl like a dog or climb the walls, or all three simultaneously, if you can manage it, just because you're just horny as hell. And like Krishnamurti says, it's Krishnamurti was supposedly enlightened. Some people say he wasn't celibate, and he was saying, it's I mean, if you're going to be a lot of people who are celibate, probably most people who are celibate for spiritual reasons are just frustrated and horny and neurotic. So, I mean, if you're really going to be celibate, then you have to be celibate in as pure of a way as possible. And there's a strange sutta, I think in the Anguttara Nikaya, given a list of ways that a monk's celibacy or his brahmacharya are not pure. And I don't remember the whole list, but some of them are kind of sad, like a monk who will hide behind a wall and listen to a woman singing or talking or laughing or crying, or he'll like spy on women when they're bathing, like in a public bathing ford, like in ancient India. So, I mean, things like that. He just looks deeply into a woman's eyes when he's talking to her just to get the pleasure from that. Or he just, indulges in certain gallantries that would be inappropriate for someone who really is strictly celibate. And getting back to Jesus of Nazareth, he is famously said that any man who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So it's one thing just to be forcibly celibate because you think you ought to be. And it's a completely other thing just to have no desire for sex. I mean, if you're just burning with desire, then, I mean, sometimes a little pressure release may be beneficial. It may help you. And then getting back to New Testament again, this isn't Jesus. I think this is Paul of Tarsus. He says, what is it? It's better to marry than to burn. And the burning is with desire. So again, if you can be celibate without just being like just frustrated and horny and like neurotic about it, then go ahead. And it may be that just spanking the puppy from time to time is a kind of therapy or something that just releases the pressure and just kind of pushes reset on the hormones to some degree. But if you want my elaborate at length description, you do best to find it in page 40 of this book. And I'm just going to move on to the Proto-Pseudo-Monk's next question. The title of which is, doesn't include the cough, the title of which is Slavery, Early Retirement, or Monkhood. And then he says, in a video with Bhante G, the Australian monk that barely let you speak, you spoke about Buddhism in the West. His advice was to make a load of money and then follow the Dhamma full time. I just started my first job at 23, earning 1,000 euros per month. It is clear that I am a slave and will be a slave until retirement age. If I have a family, I will most definitely be a slave. I have formulated a plan, possibly means working 80 hours a week, maybe 2 jobs, so I can save up money until age 40 to 50, working hard for 10 to 30 years, rough estimate. After the big sacrifice, I think I could retire to Thailand after finding a way to get permanent residence. Then I could spend lots of time at the monastery, get a feel, and make the decision whether monkhood is adequate or not. Until then, until I have the experience, I can't make the decision of total renunciation. The alternative, living a simple life in the West, working normal slavery until retirement, having to deal with living around deluded beings, never able to escape the cultural conditioning and social conventions. Enlightenment seems impossible here. I struggle to keep the 5 precepts in this atmosphere. The closest to a spiritual community I have found in the West are the hedonist big booty MILFs at the yoga studio, which has not been productive for the Dhamma besides helping getting into full lotus position. In the West, only the tantric path exists. Essentially, I see only 2 options: working my entire life in the West, no spiritual community, going against the grain, practicing Dhamma as a solitary layperson, or work hard for 1 to 3 decades in the West, retire, move to Thailand, find a spiritual community, a supportive environment, creating the causes and conditions for the possibility of monkhood. The Buddha didn't advise postponing the spiritual life until old age, but I see it more as creating the optimal environment for the spiritual life if I am playing samsara on a higher difficulty setting with the intention of a future full-time Dhamma practice. Do you think this is a wise plan, or will working too much hinder any spiritual progress? Well, it does help your spiritual endeavors if you are either one, using your work as a Dhamma practice, or two, you're in the leisure class and don't have to work for a living. At least you don't have to work very hard, so that you have a lot of spare time for meditation and contemplation and study and so forth. It does seem that there is a possibility here that the proto-pseudo monk is overlooking, and that is finding a Dhamma community in the West. And finding a Dhamma community in the West does have certain advantages. For one thing, there's no culture barrier. Like if you go to Thailand and try to join a community there, you may find that the people there are very culturally conditioned into a culture that you weren't culturally conditioned into. And there's always going to be this barrier. And you're just not going to see eye to eye. You won't be able to communicate deeply in a lot of cases, most cases, just because of the aforementioned culture barrier. Stop it. We got a dog having a weird dream back there. So, So, I mean, that would be like a third option, is you find yourself a spiritual community in the West somewhere among fellow Westerners who, for the most part, on average, take Dhamma more seriously than Asians who are just going with the flow. You know, they're just following along with the mainstream of their culture to some degree. And, there'd be less of a culture barrier, a communication barrier between you. So, I mean, that would be a possibility also. There must be, I mean, I know for a fact that there are like monasteries and other like ashram type places in Europe. I assume the proto-pseudo monk is living in Europe because he's earning his salary in euros. So that would be another thing too. And I mean, you could just do some investigation. You can look around, just ask around, try and find where there are like spiritual communities, monasteries in Europe. And it's possible that you could just get kind of a extremely low paying or volunteer job as like a monastery attendant, cooking for the monks and driving them around, that sort of thing. You'd make enough to live on. And while you were there, then you could see for yourself whether that kind of lifestyle would really work for you. So that's a possibility. With regard to work being slavery, I mean, I've never really seen it that way. There are people that say that having a job is slavery, but that's just the curse of Adam. Getting back to the Bible again, it's the curse of Adam. We have to, what is it? Earn our bread by the sweat of our brow. And all because they ate that fruit. So we all have to work for a living. Even a monk, I mean, if he's a conscientious monk, he's got to do Dhamma practice for a living in addition to the chop wood, carry water stuff. So, getting back to, work, I don't consider work really to be slavery. I mean, you can run away without being hunted down and having like the front half of your foot cut off, that kind of thing. So, I mean, you can go and live under a bridge or something. You could go and renounce the world somewhere. So I don't really consider, I mean, if figuratively you can call working hard slavery, working like slaves or something. But I'm just kind of weird. I don't think that having to pay taxes is really theft either. I mean, it could arguably be called theft, but in my case anyway, I just voluntarily, or I willingly pay my taxes. So let's see. Did I answer this question? Where is the question mark? I think it's towards the end here, which is appropriate. It is better when a long question has the question mark at the end than at the beginning. So, yeah, proto-pseudo monk sees only two options, but you do have more options than that. I mean, there are lots of options. So, let's see. The two options he envisions: working his entire life in the West, no spiritual community, going against the grain, practicing Dhamma as a solitary layperson. Yeah, I can relate to that. I mean, you can have like a spiritual community online at least. You can look around, try and find a good Dhamma center, which might be, a long ways away. So you might not be able to go there like on a weekly basis or anything, just because they're scarce. And then most of the Dhamma places in the West are like, like gay rainbow Buddhism that really is more cultural Marxism than actual Dharma. Or at least a lot of those places are. So, and then the other option is work hard for 1 to 3 decades in the West, retire, move to Thailand, find a spiritual community, a supportive environment, creating the causes and conditions for the possibility of monkhood. Yeah, I mean, it might work for you if you like hot weather and just being surrounded by people of a different culture than you. The spiritual community you might actually find as good or better of a spiritual community, one that is more suited to a Westerner in the West. That is possible. One other disadvantage of waiting till you're older before you ordain is, the Burmese put it very succinctly in a saying, which is do tuet apioket, which means a monk who is ordained when he's older is difficult to admonish, difficult to teach. A pyoket is hard to talk to because you just get more set in your ways. It's like every day you put off really dedicating your life to Dhamma, you lose 2 days because you lose 1 day of your lifespan. Plus you've got 1 more day of accumulated habits of being set in your ways that have to be overcome. So, 10 years, I kind of did the same thing when I was 17. I made the aspiration of renouncing the world, and I did it when I was 27. So I was actually ahead of schedule. I had 30 as a deadline for having renounced the world, and I did it a few years early. Let's see. What is the question though? Oh, here's 2 question marks towards the end here. If I am playing samsara on a higher difficulty setting with the intention of a future full-time Dharma practice, do you think this is a wise plan? So that was plan B, I think, or the second plan of working his ass off for 10 to 30 years and then moving to Thailand with the money. But things don't always work out according to plan. See, you can't really rely on this plan of working your butt off for 10 to 30 years and then moving on to Thailand. Who knows? Thailand might be in a state of political chaos at that time. It happens every once in a while, like the army stages a coup or something. Or, who knows what your health is going to be doing? Who knows what just general world situation is going to be like 30 years from now? So putting it off, there is that disadvantage. Ultimately, you've got to follow your own heart. Just follow your own deepest intuition as to what you ought to do. And somebody who has never met you before might not be able to give you as good of advice as just deep introspection and just waiting for an answer. Just don't just act on, intellectual thoughts and planning and so forth, but just kind of be as empty as you can, peaceful as you can, and just wait for the right answer to hit you. And you're more likely to do the right thing that way. And it looks like you're playing the long game, so you're going to have time to wait for the right answer to come to you. So still though, I would keep my eyes open and try to find spiritual communities, because some of these spiritual communities, they're not necessarily Theravada Buddhist, but they're, like eclectic spiritual communities where you've got very serious Dhamma practitioners living in some place that isn't advertised. You don't find it in magazines. They don't have a website maybe. And so it may take a certain amount of investigation to find, there's this commune of people like dedicated to living a spiritual life on their own terms or whatever. Whether there's gonna be a guru there or something, I have no idea. But different places differ. But there are places like that out there. And if your karma is ripe for it, you'll find it. So when the student is ready, the teacher will come, is a Hindu saying, I think. So I guess I kind of answered that question. Yeah, working too much, it will accumulate just a few decades of habits and just habits of mind, as well as like outward behavioral habits that, there is some wisdom in the Theravada Buddhist idea that you shouldn't put it off. Like in Hinduism, that's the way you do it, is like you go through the 4 like ashrama dharmas, where you start off as the celibate brahmachari, the student, the religious student, and then you become the householder, and then you become like the forest dweller. After your kids are grown, your wife is no longer of reproductive age, and you just go out into the forest, possibly take your wife with you, live in a hut in the forest. And then if you want to go full blast, then you become the sannyasi. And you become like the early Indian Buddhist monks and just wander around homeless and beg for your food. Maybe that when you're a forest dweller, your grown children are the ones who bring you your food and take care of you and so forth, to the extent that you need taken care of. But in Buddhism, you just don't do that. It's like as soon as you're able, you're encouraged to renounce the world. But of course, it doesn't work for everybody. So you have to know yourself well enough to know whether or not that will work. And the future is unpredictable. Things rarely turn out the way that they are expected to turn out. And that's not really a question. It's not really a full answer, because I can't really give a full answer, because I don't know the details of the proto-pseudo-monk's life better than he does. And so I'm just kind of giving some extra information that maybe you can draw from as a resource. And in the meantime, or right now, I guess, I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Bray. And Bray says, what are your thoughts on alchemy? Do you think that alchemists like Nicholas Flamel and Fulcanelli, or Fulcanelli, truly discovered the secret of immortality and the ability to transmute base metals into gold? Well, it seems like if Nicholas Flamel truly discovered the secret of immortality, that he'd be alive right now. You'd think. And he probably died of old age like everybody else has died of old age. Or maybe there's, you got the ascended masters living in the Himalayas somewhere that are, like 1,000,000 years old, or let's just say 1,000. Let's take the conservative estimate of 1,000 years old. But for the most part, I think alchemy, it was based on certain misunderstandings, like trying to transmute base metals into gold by using chemical means isn't going to work, because you have to actually transform the individual atoms. And the only way like a medieval alchemist could do that would be through psychic means. So it wouldn't be so much alchemy as just, well, I guess it would kind of be alchemy. And there are alchemists to this day in Burma. I knew a monk who was a disciple of an alchemist monk. And according to this monk that I knew, his teacher, the alchemist master, could just point at things and turn them into gold. Not really appropriate for a monk. Monks aren't supposed to handle gold. But I mean, he did better than Midas. Midas actually had to touch the stuff in order to turn it into gold. But if that sort of thing really does happen, it's happening through psychic powers and not through any kind of like chemical reactions or anything. So alchemy, I mean, I've read some of Carl Jung's descriptions of what stuff alchemists did. And I mean, this is going to be like a super long Q&A. This might be the longest one ever. But I remember Carl Jung talking about how there was it was like an alchemical temple in the Near East or something. And there was this brotherhood of alchemists, and they were waiting for a certain kind of person. I think they had to be blonde with blue eyes or something to enter the temple, and then they would catch them, and then they would keep them in a tank full of some kind of oil. I think it was sesame oil. And they would feed them only figs that were soaked in sesame oil until their whole body became like waxy and almost translucent. And then after they got to that point, they would rip their head off, not just cut it off, they would pull it off. And then they would they pack it. They might have done some kind of like embalming to it, but it was already pretty much embalmed from soaking in oil all the time. And then they would pack it in like cotton wool, put it in a niche in this alcove of the temple, and then use it for like fortune telling. Somehow it would still be talking, or maybe you'd have some priest in a trance or something that could hear it talk when nobody else could hear it talk, that kind of thing. So there's all kinds of, it was sort of proto-chemistry, like astrology is like proto-astronomy. And a lot of it was based on just not understanding how things work. And a lot of it was just the cultivation of psychic powers, which probably would be the most effective aspect of alchemy, other than just learning some basic chemical reactions, learning how to make sulfuric acid or learning how to make metallic mercury, that kind of thing. That was, chemistry was sort of based on the more legit or the more chemical findings of these alchemists. But I don't think that they discovered the secret of immortality or the ability to transmute base metals into gold. Otherwise, there'd be a lot of immortal people walking around with lots and lots of gold on them. And you just don't see that. It may be very few people have lived longer than 200 years just through being in harmony with the Tao or some kind of spiritual practice. And likewise, it may be that some people have been able to transmute base metals into gold, just like our friend Jesus of Nazareth supposedly transmuted water into wine. It would be a psychic thing. It would be like vulgarly referred to as a miracle and not some sort of cookbook practice that you do. And with that, I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Jeffrey. And Jeffrey says, do you know anything about Thor, Freya, and Valhalla? Well, I know Thor was a Germanic god of thunder. He wielded the hammer. He got turned into a superhero in Marvel Comics, which then got turned into increasingly woke movies with like black Valkyries and so forth. Freya, I think there's two Germanic deities with similar names. I can't remember if Freya was the female goddess of love and beauty, sort of like the Germanic Venus that Friday is named after, or whether it was a male with a similar name. I've never really studied Germanic, don't want to call it mythology, polytheism, the Germanic pantheon. I've never really studied it much. As a kid, like a teenager, I read like Bullfinch's mythology that had a section about Germanic mythology. But Valhalla, I know enough about Valhalla or Walhalla to know that, it's like the Valkyries would go out and search the battlefields for slain heroes that died valiantly. And then they would bring their spirits back to Valhalla, which was like a big feasting hall. It kind of reminds me of like the feasting hall in Beowulf, where, they'd be drinking mead and just having a good time, partying, essentially. And that's a very crude understanding, I am sure. I think anyone who really knows this stuff thoroughly and takes it seriously could correct me on all sorts of things and could just provide lots more information than I do. But with regard to polytheism, the polytheism that I've most been interested in, of course, first of all, you got Indian polytheism. Buddhism has got some small g gods in it. And then also classical, like Greco-Roman polytheism. So I've been more interested in like Apollo and Hephaestus and Athena than in Germanic gods. I don't know why that is. Maybe past lives I was more religious as like a Greco-Roman than I was as a Germanic tribesman or something. But I really don't know that much about them. So I'm going to move on to the next question here. This is from GameFap. And GameFap says, have you ever been recognized on the streets before? Has any kid ever said, look, Mom, it's the dankest Buddhist on the interwebs, Panyo Basa? Also, how come in every video you do with Brian Ruhe, you start off by saying, yeah, hail Brian? Well, that's two questions. I'm going to have to separate these. So we got way more than 50 questions here. First question from GameFap, have I ever been recognized on the streets? Not as a layperson. As a monk, sometimes I would get recognized on the street, especially in Burma where I was semi-famous. I remember once being invited to somebody's house. I mean, it was another monk I was with got invited to their house, and he brought me with him. And there was a picture of me on their altar. Excuse me. I just said excuse me because I was waving my hand around and hit the lamp. Excuse me, Mr. Lamp. And they had a picture of me on the altar, and they definitely knew who I was. I mean, there was a couple of books and like magazine articles and stuff written about me there. But here, especially in South Carolina, which is in the Bible Belt, there aren't a whole lot of Buddhists around. And so it would be pretty unusual. I'm working at a sheet metal shop, and some construction worker comes to pick up an order, and it's like, whoa, you used to be a monk. I've seen your YouTube videos. It's never happened. I'm just not that famous in America anymore. I mean, I never was all that famous, but it's probably gone down a bit since I stopped being a monk. So I guess I'll just move on to GameFap's second question. And how come in every video you do with Brian Ruhe, you start off by saying, yeah, hail Brian? Well, I hail Brian, hail Brian. It's just the thing to do. It's the appropriate means of hailing Brian Ruhe. You say, hail Brian. And the yeah at the beginning, I think he's just like welcoming me to his show, and I'm just kind of agreeing or, like acknowledging his welcome by saying yeah. So I guess I answered that question. And so I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Mr. Pranav. And Mr. Pranav says, well, isn't it that most people wind up in lower planes, not in human realm, and about the simile of a turtle and the plank, which shows how hard it is to gain a human rebirth? Okay, this is in response to, I think it was maybe the previous Q&A, where I was talking about how, if you die with a human mind, you're probably going to be human. If you die with a godlike mind, you're going to be reborn as a god. If you die with an animalistic mind or a demonic mind, you're more likely to be reborn as an animal or a demon, that kind of thing. And I did say that most people are reborn as people because being people, as a general rule, we have human minds. And so our karma is like human karma with human stuff that needs to be resolved. And so we generally wind up being a human again. And it's relatively difficult to move upwards. And he refers to the simile of the turtle and the plank, but the purpose, I might as well mention the simile of the turtle, and it's a yoke rather than a plank. It's kind of like a toilet seat. It was a thing that went around like the horse or the bullock's neck when it was pulling a plow or like a chariot or something. And so you've got this yoke, or it's like a toilet seat. Let's call it a toilet seat. You got this toilet seat floating around on the surface of the ocean, and once every 100 years, a big sea turtle will come up for air. Just once every 100 years, it comes up for air and takes a breath and then goes back down for another 100 years. And according to the sutta, that the odds of an animal being reborn as a human are, it's going to take longer than for the turtle swimming through the world's oceans to just through random chance come up with its head right up to the middle of that toilet seat or the yoke. So, the simile is not with regard to the difficulty of getting human birth once you're already a human. It's the difficulty of getting a human birth for an animal. Because it's got animalistic karma. It really doesn't have much human karma. It has to be really an outstanding animal that has done outstanding karma. And from the Buddhist point of view, and I don't really accept this, but from a Buddhist point of view, animals really can't earn merit. But I mean, there's exceptions. There's the frog that went to heaven and all this. But it's supposed to be much more difficult for an animal to earn merit. But I do think that animals can earn merit. It's going to be animal merit. It's going to be kind of at a smaller scale than human merit, as a general rule. The best human is better than the best dog, for example. Hope I didn't just offend dog lovers out there. But it's like the worst human is worse than the worst dog. The best human is better than the best dog. It's just we've got more variation. Our bell-shaped curve is much broader. So, yeah, I mean, mainly once you're in the animal realm, it's very difficult to get out of the animal realm. That's the main point of that sutta, of that simile. So, but once you're a human, chances are, if you are reborn, you will be reborn as another human, just because your karma is predominantly human. So I'm just going to move on to Mr. Pranav's next question here, which is, what does the word bhavana mean? Could it be translated as meditation, and how different is it from samadhi or jhana? Well, bhavana literally means something like becoming. Bhava is existence or being. And bhavana is sort of like a present participle turned into a noun. So it's becoming or being. Although in Buddhism, it generally means something more like development or cultivation. So bhavana means something like mental cultivation, which has become pretty much of a synonym for meditation. So it means meditation in general. It's different from samadhi or jhana. Samadhi is a certain mental state of concentration that you strengthen, you cultivate that when you practice meditation. And jhana, of course, it's the controversial term of the 4 stages of meditation, or the 4 stages of absorption. And I shouldn't spend a lot of time discussing that because, as I say, we got a merciless onslaught of questions today. So the word bhavana literally means something, literally it means like being or becoming, but it pretty much means development or cultivation as a Buddhist jargon term. And then the cultivation is mental cultivation, which primarily means meditation. And samadhi is just an aspect of meditation. Jhana is like a goal of meditation, or certain levels of meditation. So, they all overlap, but they do not have the same meaning. And so I'm going to move into the next question, which is from Fred. And Fred says, do Brahman and Nibbana have something in common? Yeah, they have a lot in common. In fact, I would go so far as to say that a Vedantist like Shankara, what he was calling Brahman is what a Buddhist would call Nibbana, or at least they're both attempting to describe the ultimate state. So the Vedantist Hindus call it Brahman, or better yet, Nirguna Brahman, which is like ultimate reality, which has no discernible characteristics. And the Buddhists call it Nibbana, but the main difference is that Brahman is and Nibbana kind of isn't. I've discussed this many times before, where Nibbana, or the absolute, is just completely off the scale. It really, the duality of is and isn't do not apply. The is and isn't are invalid. To say that Nibbana is invalid. To say that it isn't is invalid. To say that it is and isn't is invalid. To say that it neither is nor isn't is invalid. So the Hindus, or the Vedantists, have reified the absolute and calling it it exists. When you get into the more subtle philosophy, they kind of back off from that, because like Nirguna Brahman has no discernible characteristics. So how does something exist if it has no discernible characteristics, if it has no qualities? So it's 2 attempts at describing the same ultimate state. And the Hindus with Brahman are coming more from the side of is, And the Buddhists with Nibbana are coming more from the side of isn't, although ultimately the whole duality of is and isn't does not apply to the absolute. That's just samsaric perceptions, distinctions, papancha, if you will. So I'll just move on to Fred's next question here, which is, was avijja always there before time? And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Sanskrit and Pali terminology, avijja means ignorance. Ignorance of reality. So it's kind of a synonym for delusion. And was it always there before time? Well, I mean, there was no before time. Time itself is like a perceptual construct. So, I mean, ignorance also is like a perceptual construct. So they're pretty much simultaneous, avijja and time. I mean, I don't think you're going to have time without avijja. And I guess you could have avijja without time, but the time is just kind of built into the system. It's part of the uncarved block of marble. And it's avijja that is trying to identify individual statues contained within the uncarved block of marble and thinking that those statues are real. But you're not going to have any kind of perceptual change without time. So I just, there is no beginning. There is no before time or before avijja or before samsara, because samsara, the potential for samsara, is always there. And so it's always been there. It always will be there. So avijja and the perception of time will always exist. There's not going to be any liberation of all beings, because the possibility of these beings that don't really exist anyway other than in potential form, I mean, that potential is always going to be there. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Joe Doe. And Joe Doe says, you mentioned that you think the Buddha might have had combat training. What credible source states this? I've never heard it mentioned from any other teacher. As far as teachings from the suttas, from what I could find, there is only one book written by some lady in the 2000s that states this. Doesn't surprise me that someone out there would try to link the Buddha to put a stain upon his peaceful image with thoughts of a possible training in violence. Certain people want war associated in everything. From what I know, the Buddha was sheltered by his father from the outside world. Do you think such speculation could be bad karma? No. I mean, going with tradition, Buddhist tradition, the Buddha was a kshatriya, which was the warrior caste, the warrior and ruling caste of India, or the warrior and ruling varna, the class, the hereditary class. So, according to tradition anyway, the Buddha was born into the warrior class, and he was somewhat of an aristocrat. So naturally, as a boy, he would have received certain trainings like archery, horsemanship, like just a certain amount of strategy, that kind of stuff. That would have just been part of his education, assuming that he really was of the kshatriya varna. So, I mean, there are stories, I think they're mostly commentarial, about how, I vaguely remember some story about how Devadatta, I mean, it's like young Siddhartha and his cousin Devadatta were out shooting target practice, and Devadatta sees a bird flying by, so he just turns and shoots the bird, and then it falls to the ground, and then the Buddha, the young Siddhartha who's going to become the Buddha, out of compassion, he goes and protects the bird and won't give it to Devadatta and won't let Devadatta finish it off, that kind of thing. So assuming that the tradition is right, that the Buddha was born into the warrior class, then in all likelihood he did receive a certain amount of education with regard to the use of weapons and horsemanship and strategy and stuff like that. So, but he renounced it. So, I mean, it's not really a stain on his character or anything. I mean, he was just born into it. So, And it was ancient times. So, I mean, most civilizations that have survived long enough to be recognized by history have not been pacifistic. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if he did receive a certain amount of training. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if when he was a young boy, he actually did stuff like shooting birds with arrows, that kind of thing. I'm not saying that he did. I'm just saying it wouldn't surprise me if he did, because boys do that kind of stuff. You're out target practicing, you see some bird fly by or something, you might just take a shot at it. Who knows? So anyways, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siovak and Sipat Zidana. I'm checking to see what the time is here. Yeah, almost an hour already. By golly. It's a good thing that some people like watching long videos, because this one's going to be kind of a long one, I think. Anyways, Siovak and Sipat Zidana says, Buddha mentioned ugliness and poverty as a result of bad karma. What about manletism? And manletism, based on this link that he sent, is about being a short guy. And I mean, if a guy is short and it doesn't cause him any problems, he doesn't receive any flack for it or anything, maybe he's a pygmy where shortness is valued. If you're too tall, you get kicked out of the tribe, that kind of thing. Then that might be good karma. But if he gets like teased because of it, or he just catches hell because of it, he's short, then yeah, there'd be some karma involved, because I mean, karma is involved, according to Abhidhamma philosophy anyway, with regard to everything you experience. Every sensation you experience, every feeling you feel is the fruition of karma, at least to some degree. So if you're short, then yeah, that's going to be as a result of your karma. And if your shortness is causing you more unpleasantness than pleasantness, I mean, there are certain advantages to being short. I mean, if it starts raining, you're the last person to get wet. Hardly ever bump your head on stuff unless maybe you're sweeping under the kitchen table or some such. So, yeah. So the answer to that is what I just said. And I'm going to move on to Siovak and Sipat Zidana's next question here. And I do appreciate Siovak and Sipat Zidana not providing me with videos to watch or long essays to read with, like, what is your reaction to this on this Q&A? So anyways, his next question is, what is your personal favorite story narrative from the Buddhist tradition? For example, one might enjoy the story of a bodhisattva killing a woman out of compassion to prevent her from killing a fly due to how absurd it is, or the story of Mahamoggallana going to the various hell realms to find his dead mother. Well, probably my two favorite stories in the texts would be the story of the Bahia Sutta. That made a pretty strong impression on me as a junior monk, so much so that my first blog was the Bahia blog, or as I wanted to call it that. I think that was like the website, the Bahia blog at blogspot.com, which is now defunct. And then The Outsider is my new blog, and The Outsider is like the literal translation of the name Bahia. So the story of Bahia, who was a non-Buddhist ascetic, he wore a garment made out of tree bark, although it was probably like the fibrous inner bark that was then woven into a kind of burlap or something. And he thought that he had a lot of respect from people. He lived on the west coast of India and was getting a lot of respect from people, and was starting to think that maybe he was enlightened. And then a deva, a deity, small g god, who had formerly been a relative of his, came to him and said, "You're not fully enlightened, but there is this fully enlightened being called Gautama Buddha, who lives, in the Ganges Valley, way the hell over by Magadha, and he's the real deal." So then immediately Bahia was so moved by this that he just packed his stuff and just took off walking, just stopping just enough to sleep every night, and then just get up early the next morning and just keep walking until he finds the Buddha. And he finds the Buddha while the Buddha's going for alms, I think in the city of Sawati. And he begs him, teach me Dhamma. And the Buddha says, now is not an appropriate time. I'm walking for alms. But Bahia says, you don't know when you're going to die in this world. Please teach me now. So then finally the Buddha teaches him this very Zen-like teaching, which then causes Bahia, who is very ripe and really ready for it, he becomes enlightened. And then immediately afterwards, he gets trampled to death by a young cow. And then the Buddha has him cremated as though he were a fully ordained monk, even though he wasn't really, he wasn't an ordained monk at all. I mean, technically he wasn't even a Buddhist. So that's one of my favorite stories. It's Udana 110 if you want to read the original. And also just the Gautika Sutta is really, it's one of my favorite stories. I've described that before, and I've translated it. I think it's in my first book, Essays in Theravada Buddhism, about Gautika, who committed suicide and became enlightened at the moment of committing suicide. There's a lot more to it than that. There's some weird stuff about the Mara, the evil one, just looking like a mist who's moving across the ground. And then the Buddha points this out to the monks when they go to cremate Gautika, who was lying there dead because he committed suicide. And he said, you see that mist moving back and forth across the ground there? That's Mara, the evil one, looking for the spirit of Gautika, but he's not going to find it because the consciousness of Gautika is now unmanifest, which is kind of an interesting and controversial way of describing enlightenment, unmanifest consciousness. So anyways, those are like my two favorites. I guess the Bahia Sutta has been one of my favorites for a longer period of time and has had more of an effect on my my personality or outlook on life or whatever. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Siovach and Sipad Zidana. And he says, can you please explain what all these positions mean when it says something exists, doesn't exist, both exists and doesn't exist, and neither exists nor doesn't exist? Maybe using an example when each of these cases does apply would help understanding what they mean. Well, I mean, it doesn't even really matter what they mean because it technically is ruling out all possibilities, all logical possibilities. You've got A, you've got not A. You've got A and not A. You've got neither A nor not A. And none of those apply to certain questions. Like, does a Tathagata exist after death? Or, well, that's good enough for now. But see what all these positions mean. Those four positions are applied throughout Nagarjuna's Mula Majjhimaka Karaka. I think the very first question he addresses is an effect the same as the cause which caused it? And he rules out yes, he rules out no, he rules out yes and no, he rules out neither yes nor no. I think he rules out yes, is the cause and the effect the same because there wouldn't be any change. At least, that's kind of the argument he uses. It'd be the same. I mean, you wouldn't differentiate them. But if they were different, then he was saying that the effect doesn't even need the cause if they're not the same. I mean, it's sort of it's not really sophisticated logic in my opinion. There are logical ways of answering the question, but then he rules out yes and no because that's just kind of meaningless. Neither yes nor no also is just kind of illogical and meaningless too. So, but getting back to something exists or doesn't exist, both does and doesn't exist. Well, I guess a good example would be, the Tathagata after death or Nibbana itself really. It doesn't really exist because, it's just infinite and formless, but you can't say that it doesn't exist either. Trying to even explain the existence or non-existence of Nibbana or the absolute or the enlightened being after death or whatever, it's just sort of a brain warper. But ultimately, the point is that it doesn't even matter what the meaning is because no matter what meaning you plug into that, it's the same. It's just ruling out all logical possibilities. So I suppose maybe I could have studied up for this so I could give a a knowledgeable discourse on what exactly it means to say that something exists or doesn't exist. But I mean, the existence and non-existence are both like mental states. They're artifacts of perception. And you're dealing with something that in reality is beyond perception. And so all these different dichotomies or different categories just don't apply to reality. They apply only to this virtual reality of perception. And I didn't answer that very well, I suppose, but it's time to move on to the next question. And this is from Mooners. And Mooners says, can you look into the online Hindu YouTube community? Apparently there are individuals such as Abhijit Chavda, Sham Sharma, and Rajiv Malhotra who claim that slavery didn't exist in ancient India, caste was a Portuguese invention, and that the Indo-Europeans came out of India. There are millions of people who watch and believe this nonsense, and we need people to point this out. Well, the only Hindu that I ever watch on YouTube, occasionally, not very often, probably less than once a month, is, I don't even remember his name, but he is the one who calls Hinduism Sanatana Dharma. And when I was a monk, I was compared to him sometimes. I was sort of like the Buddhist version of him or something. But I don't remember him putting forth any of these three positions. That slavery didn't exist in ancient India. Well, it pretty obviously did. Like in the ancient Buddhist texts, there's actually rules saying that you can donate slaves to a monastery. I mean, this probably doesn't go all the way back to the Buddha, but like even in classical Sanskrit, like drama, I'm pretty sure you've got like the smart ass slave girl is like was it like a stock character in these plays. But I mean, probably what some of these Hindus are saying is that the word dasa doesn't really mean slave. It means something else. I saw this one argument that there were no slaves in ancient India because dasa can't mean slave, because dasa is an ethnicity. It was like the darker skinned Aboriginal people, like mostly Dravidians, I guess, that existed in India, as opposed to the Indo-Aryans who, according to most archaeologists, invaded northwestern India in around 1500 BC or so. But I mean, you could say the same with regard to English, that you could say, well, there's no slaves in English because the word slave is itself just a corruption of the word Slav, which is an ethnicity. So, I mean, in English, Slav became the word for slave because the Slavs were an ethnicity that was enslaved a lot in like early medieval Europe. And it's the same with Dasa in India, that it was an ethnicity that was primarily the ones that were enslaved. So, I mean, they might just say that Dasa came to mean servant, but the evidence really doesn't support that. And mainly, these same people here, they're starting off with this idea that India is just the greatest. It's just this magnificent, miraculous, enlightened culture that never had slavery and never had a real caste system, and it's been around for thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, and that all the European culture came from India, and the only people that actually believe this stuff are Indians or Westerners who have converted to Hinduism and are just really on the bandwagon and believe what they're told from the Indians. So, yeah, it's pretty obvious that there were slaves. There was obviously a caste system. I mean, the Buddha himself was considered to be of the Kshatriya caste or class. Ancient Pali texts clearly mention Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. So how could the Portuguese have invented that before the Portuguese existed? And the idea that the Indo-Europeans came out of India, it's a fringe theory that is believed almost entirely by the same two groups I just mentioned, just like chauvinistic Indians who think that everything great came from India, and Western converts to Hinduism who are just accepting the dogma and just believing it because that's what they're told. But the evidence does suggest the Indo-Europeans probably came from like the Pontic steppes. It's like the steppes in southeastern Europe, north of the Black and Caspian Seas, where the Caucasus Mountains coincidentally are. And that it started off as like the Yamnaya civilization, and then they were like the Kurgans, is like the chieftains would have these big burial mounds to honor them, and that was what eventually evolved into the Buddhist pagoda or stupa. It's just like a later manifestation of these Proto-Indo-European burial mound kurgans. So, people are going to believe whatever they want to believe. People are going to believe that, the moon landing was faked, and other people believe that the moon actually exists. And, people are just going to believe all kinds of stuff. And there's, if they're insisting upon it, like you're talking to a Jehovah's Witness, good luck trying to persuade him that some of the stuff that the Jehovah's Witnesses believe is just kind of silly, actually. Good luck trying to explain that to them. They're not going to hear it. They're just going to get offended, or they're just going to just walk away or whatever. So you're just going to have to study the evidence as best you can and make up your mind as best you can. Or if you're going to be a skeptic in the classical sense, just suspend judgment and admit that you don't know. So I can say all this without actually looking into the Hindu online YouTube community. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Skoladin or Skuladin. And this is another one of these kind of a short question that's expanded into a long question. And this has the question mark at the beginning. The first sentence here is actually the question. The rest is like commentary to the question. So Skuladin says, "Would you kindly explain hypnotism?" ? And then he's got like these bullet points. It has multiple theories which contradict each other: animal magnetism, neurosis theory, suggestion theory, ... It can be either mental or physical. It can be achieved through each of the 5 senses except smell and taste, as far as I know. The hypnotizer can be oneself, an inanimate object, an animal, a bright reflective surface, a suggestion, certain pressure points or rhythmic patterns like a belly dance. And the last bullet point says the hypnotized can be an individual or a crowd, and even interspecies like a snake and a bird, or a snake and a snake charmer. So getting back to the actual question here, would you kindly explain hypnotism? Well, most of what I know about hypnotism, I learned from my father, who was an amateur hypnotist. In fact, he learned about hypnotism when he was a medic in World War II. I think even before he was a medic in World War II, he was an X-ray technician in the U.S. Army before World War II started. And as a medic, he was called the voodoo medic because he had learned that if someone is in a state of shock, like from a traumatic injury, like they just got shot, then they're essentially in a hypnotic trance. They are in a trance state, and then you can use the same like suggestions to a person in a shock that you could use to a hypnotized person. You could say, you're not going to feel the pain. You're going to contract the blood vessels in this area to reduce blood loss. You might not use those exact words, but that's the effect. And he found out you can do this. And so more normie people in the army, the army's got a lot of normies in it, we're just calling him the voodoo medic because of this. But it is kind of interesting that he considered the mental state of somebody in a state of shock, like traumatic shock, to be a kind of hypnotic trance. So exactly how it works, I don't know exactly how it works. I've never really tried to understand exactly how it works. It's just like an element of human nature, and the fact that apparently small animals can be hypnotized by snakes, that it's might be kind of universal to vertebrates or something, that your mind can just kind of zone out into a kind of trance state, and maybe a kind of like like I'm not going to call it a holding pattern, but just sort of like I'm trying to come up with a word where your mind, you're not thinking anything in particular. You just go into a trance, but like I'm trying to apply that to something else and it's not working. So I'll just skip that part where I'm trying to use a certain word that I can't think of. And, but I mean, hypnotism, yeah, I mean, I'm not a good hypnotic subject. I was hypnotized as a child by my father, who helped him to consider me to be some kind of prodigy, I think, because according to him, you have to be a certain mental age before you can even be hypnotized. So it might be older squirrels and snakes that are hypnotized by or older squirrels and birds that are hypnotized by snakes. But he did hypnotize me when I was a kid. According to him, I don't remember this, into thinking that my big toe was growing. Well, his attempts to hypnotize me as an adult failed. There was another hypnotist tried to hypnotize me as an adult when I was a monk, actually, and that also failed. I mean, I might have gotten just very sort of borderline. Yeah, I was kind of like in a borderline state, but never got beyond that. And that's one reason why I wasn't able to do certain kinds of samatha meditation as well, because in Burma especially, like hypnotic trance and jhana, some teachers just cannot tell the difference. So it is true that you get into one of these states and it does have a profound effect on your body. Like you can hypnotize somebody and then touch them with a pencil eraser, just a regular pencil eraser, and tell them that this is a red hot poker, and they'll actually get a blister. They'll feel the pain and actually get a 2nd degree burn on their skin from being touched by a pencil eraser at room temperature. Or, there's the standard cases of the person's body becomes so rigid, you can rest their feet on the back of one chair and their head on the back of another chair, and they're just like a plank going, just held up by their feet and the back of their head in between these two chairs, that kind of thing. So, I mean, it's obviously a real state. The Stanford Hypnosis Lab. I did read a book about hypnosis from the Stanford Hypnosis Lab too. It is kind of interesting that their standardized method, they're trying to be scientific about it, so they have to use the same method to hypnotize everybody, so that to kind of rule out variation as much as possible. That it's mainly just focusing on a small spot on the wall, which is like a small casino disc, which further complicates the difference between certain kinds of samatha meditation and just self-hypnosis. So, let's see. I'm going through the bullet points here. Multiple theories which contradict each other because people don't understand it very well. It can be either mental or physical. Well, obviously, it's predominantly mental, although it does have physical side effects. It can be achieved through each of the 5 senses except smell and taste. Yeah, I guess so. And see, the hypnotizer can be oneself, an inanimate object. Well, I mean, inanimate object, yeah, I guess if you're looking at like a spinning disc or something, but that doesn't mean, I guess it's still inanimate, even though it's moving, because there's no spirit animating it or something. Bright reflective surface suggestion, let's see. Rhythmic patterns like a belly dance. Does the belly dancer herself get hypnotized, or is it the people observing the belly dancer that get hypnotized? Yeah, I mean, it is just built into the human person, the human species. Some people are way better hypnotic subjects than others. Like in that book from the Stanford Hypnosis Lab, or by a professor who worked there or something, he was saying that there was like a way you can tell whether a person's going to be a good hypnotic subject. Like when you're reading a book, you get so immersed in it that you just become oblivious to everything around you. That would be a good indication that you'd be a good hypnotic subject. And what would be the evolutionary purpose of this capacity to be hypnotized? I mean, partly it could just be groupthink, mass hysteria. And also just being able to go into a trance. I mean, if my father was correct when he was the voodoo medic, that like shock and hypnotic trance have a lot of overlap, then it could have something to do with that from a biological point of view. But I really don't know what the exact mechanics of hypnosis are. So Since I've just confessed that I really don't know exactly how it works, I guess I should just move on to Mooners' or Skuladin. Sorry, Skuladin, for thinking that you were Mooners there for a second. Move on to the second sub-question, I guess, about hypnotism. Would you kindly explain the supersensory aspect of hypnotism, such as the Indian fakirs who could walk on fire, sleep on beds of nails, Edgar Cayce, whose power was originally to read books while he slept, then became clairvoyance and past life readings? Well, the Indian fakirs, I mean, it looks kind of like faker, and to some degree, some of these fakirs are kind of fakers, because walking on fire, I learned how you do that. It's pretty simple, actually. I mean, there are like seminars you can go where you're guaranteed to be able to walk on fire just after this, 2-hour seminar or something. And it's like you're nervous, and so not only the palms of your hands, but the soles of your feet get sweaty. And because of the sweat on the soles of your feet, no matter how hot the fire is, can't get above the boiling point of water, 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees centigrade. And that keeps you from getting severely burned. So, I mean, that's just kind of a trick. Also, sleeping on beds of nails. My father explained this to me, how if the nails are close enough together, they're sharing the pressure of the weight of your body among so many nail points that really it's not that bad. And they just get used to some discomfort. I mean, it's probably not as comfy as a Sealy Posturepedic, but still, anybody can lie down on a bed of nails if they do it carefully. You don't want to just put all your weight on your hands or something when you're getting onto the bed. You have to learn to lower yourself down so that the pressure is evenly distributed amongst all these nail points. But with regard to Edgar Cayce, I guess he would auto-induce hypnotic trance. And I did read in a book about Edgar Cayce once that the reason he was able to do this, according to him, he had a past life regression as a soldier who died very slowly on a battlefield. He was a soldier that was just left for dead on a battlefield. And he was in agonizing pain and was just lying there, just dying very slowly. It took him, a matter of a few days for him to finally die. And so just through sheer desperation, he somehow cultivated the ability to just sort of detach his mind from his body while he was this dying soldier. And then he was able to use that to his advantage and the advantage of others in his life as Edgar Cayce. But the supersensory aspect of hypnotism, again, if these questions they're about a subject that I'm really no authority on. But I have seen I don't know if it's hypnotic trance or not, but in southern India, there are certain Shaivite Hindus that will they'll just run skewers through their cheeks and eat glass light bulbs and all this weird stuff that you would think would be very painful, possibly even fatal if you're eating broken glass. And for some reason, they seem to be fine afterwards. Maybe some interesting scars or something. But exactly how it works is mind over matter. Ultimately, I would say it's mind over matter. I'm not a materialist. Mind comes first. Mind is the forerunner. According to the first verse of the Dhammapada, mind is chief. These things of the world are mind-made. So, it's I assume that's one way of explaining the whole phenomenon, not just the supersensory aspect, is that really we're creating this world with our mind. It's a manifestation of spirit. And so you can kind of break the rules, sort of like the people in the Matrix that are in the resistance. Certain rules can be bent, other rules can be broken. And so it might be like a mind over matter kind of a thing that's just built into us in potential form. And some people are able to cultivate that. Some people just have a natural talent in that direction. And so, maybe being in a trance state can help you to overcome some of your conditioning in believing that what you're about to do is impossible. Something like that. And with that, I'm going to move on to Skaladin's third question about, let's see, I guess this is also about hypnosis. Would you kindly explain the limits of suggestion in relation to nature? It seems whether it was animals or people, if something was against the subject's nature, the suggester would be unsuccessful unless they broke the subject's will, like Pavlov and his dogs, or Alex from A Clockwork Orange. Yeah, my father used to say that if you hypnotize somebody, you can't get them to do something that they wouldn't do normally. Like, you can't hypnotize a person and tell them, to pick up this gun and go shoot so-and-so. But you could hypnotize them to think that this real gun is just a plastic squirt gun or a toy gun. And you can say, as a joke, go and squirt that person with this squirt gun, and then they might actually go and shoot the person. In fact, I remember my mother used to watch these detective shows when I was a kid, like Columbo and, who was it? Wasn't Columbo? It was the guy who would just pester the criminal until they would just confess in exasperation to get him to leave him alone. Anyway, there was this woman who committed suicide by jumping off a building, but for some reason she took her blouse and her skirt off before she jumped, and then it turned out that someone had hypnotized her and told her that she was going to dive into a swimming pool. So, I mean, she took her clothes off because she thought she was going to get wet. She just like plummeted off like an 8th-story building. So, yeah, I mean, let's see, kindly explain the limits of suggestion in relation to nature. These are tough questions. They're kind of subtle questions and, in a way, kind of vague questions that I don't fully entirely grasp, especially because I'm no authority on hypnosis, even though my father was a hypnotist, and I have read about hypnotism and also watched that episode of Columbo when I was a kid. So, let's see. It seems whether it was animals or people, if something was against the subject's nature, the suggester would be unsuccessful unless they broke the subject's will. Yeah, well, breaking someone's will, that's a completely different subject. And if you really want to understand the power of breaking someone's will, read a book called Battle for the Mind by William Sargent. It'd be like in the top 10 of just important books I've ever read that really changed the way I look at things. And in this case, looking at the way the human mind works. But I'm not going to go on give a book report on it because we got lots of questions and we've already been going for well over an hour. So getting back to this question though, would you kindly explain the limits of suggestion? Yeah, well, I mean, it's like, even if you hypnotize somebody and you can suggest to them things, you can tell them they're gonna feel this or whatever. It causes their imagination to have more power over what they think is real. But it's not going to go against their deep conscience or something unless you can somehow trick them, or as this question specifies, just break their will. Just kind of break them down. But even then, it would be hard to get them to do something that deep down they know is evil. I mean, Alex from A Clockwork Orange, they just made him nauseous every time he saw sex and violence, until finally he was like conditioned in a Pavlovian manner to just feel icky and nauseous whenever he would see or think of sex and violence. So, I mean, that's not really going against his nature. I mean, it's just playing upon a person's nature not to like nausea. And I don't like nausea either. So it says right here that I'm halfway done, approximately, through these questions. I put a little marker because it always catches me by surprise when I get to the end. So I'm going to be less surprised now. So anyway, the next question is from Romeo. And Romeo says, I'm a fairly recent explorer of Buddhism and I'm having difficulty getting my head around the concept of rebirth or reincarnation. I'm wondering if your understanding of what we call old souls will help me more readily embrace rebirth or reincarnation. We've all encountered old souls at some point in our lives, someone young who is wise beyond their years compared to their peers in terms of insight, temperament, understanding, sensitivity, and overall maturity, where does their precociousness come from? Do old souls tie in any way to the concept of rebirth or reincarnation? Are old souls the result of having lived past lives? Perhaps finding a connection between old souls, a concept I know exists because I've actually seen them in my life, will help me understand and more readily embrace rebirth and reincarnation. Okay, so I do have some experience with old souls. In fact, I'm generally considered to be a relatively old soul myself. My father told me once that he had an old soul, but I was older than him. So that would make me, in a sense anyway, older than both of my parents, because really, I mean, bless my mother. You know, she tried her best to be a good mother to me, and was not a bad person, but spiritually, she was not an old soul. I mean, she was like a toddler. And it also reminds me of a really interesting story by J.D. Salinger called Teddy, about this boy. He's like maybe 9 years old, and he lives in this really dysfunctional family from New York City. And he just happens to be enlightened. He's an enlightened being. And he's explaining his sister, his kid sister is just horrible. I mean, she is just really just an icky little kid. And just cruel and just mean and just... Anyway, Teddy is explaining his sister, kind of speaking up for her, saying that she hasn't been a human being for very many lives. You know, so you got old souls and young souls. You know, so an old soul is someone with a lot of momentum going as a human being or higher than a human being. A young soul would be someone who hasn't been a human being very many times. You know, they're still kind of in like a crude level of humanity. And I mean, it helps to explain certain things like Mozart, for example, who he just hit the ground running with regard to music. I mean, he was supposedly writing symphonies when he was still a little kid. Or another example is, I read this biography of a lion tamer. He was in the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey circus as like one of their star lion tamers. And he just wanted to be a lion tamer since he was a little kid. It's like even when he was a kid, he was like catching raccoons and stuff and like training them. He was just like really on track with this. It was like his life's purpose was already clear to him, that this is what he needed to do. And he eventually became like an art teacher at like some community college or something, but still he'd be like catching wild animals and training them and everything until finally he realized, I just have to do this. And so he winds up being one of the world's greatest lion tamers. And some people, they just have these weird talents that it might be difficult to explain through genetics and past experience. And in a way, I can make guesses at what my past lives supposedly were, not through past life regressions or memories, just from these fascinations I've got that really are hard to explain through genetics and past experience. Like certain periods in history, certain cultures and periods in history, I really resonate with that. I just find it very deeply interesting. And other cultures and periods in history, I'm just not interested. I just don't care. So, I do think that old souls, or just people who are mature beyond their years, you know, they've cultivated wisdom in a past life. That would certainly be a Buddhist explanation for the phenomenon. And on the contrary, someone who's just really extraordinarily foolish or just shallow, you know, they maybe haven't been a human being as many times, or they've just got a lot of bad karma from past lives that has hindered them in certain ways. But I don't think you can really prove it one way or the other. You can just present evidence that may be more or less persuasive or convincing, but still something like this, it's you know, essentially paranormal. And anything that's paranormal is never really going to be conclusively proven, in my opinion. You know, it's always going to be on the fringe. That's just the nature of the paranormal. It's just on the outskirts and just kind of bleeding through the cracks in the rules that give our worlds like structure and predictability. And something like reincarnation, yeah, it's there's no way you can really prove or disprove it. But wiser people than me have believed in it. So, including like Neem Karoli Baba, that I think may have been a fully enlightened being. The Buddha himself apparently believed in it, or at least endorsed the idea. So, yeah, I accept reincarnation or rebirth as a working hypothesis, knowing full well that I can't really prove or disprove it. And old souls are a kind of contributing evidence. It's certainly not going to prove anything, but it's certainly, a little more weight on the scale, for the rebirth camp, I guess, unless some kind of skeptical materialists can prove that an old soul is there for other reasons. Like in my case, it could be just a kind of maturity that I inherited from my father's side of the family or something. But anyways, I'm going to move on to the next question here. And this is from Fenrissen. And I don't think Fenrissen has asked any questions before. So welcome, Fenrissen, unless you've changed your name like so many people do when they ask questions. Some people change their name every few weeks. But Fenrissen says, was there ever a problem after you came back that people complained or saw you as apathetic to everyday problems? Even with my little understanding of Buddhism, when I started not letting worries bother me so much, I found that most people would be drawn to me, thinking I was just laid back, but after a while they would become aggravated at the way I just seemingly didn't care. And I think, how do I answer this? I really am not a very social person. I don't have like a wide circle of friends. A lot of acquaintances online, people I work with and so forth. But like going to other people's houses, I haven't done that in a very long time. Or just having people come over to our house to hang out, socialize, it happens rarely. And my woman and I are pretty much the same. We're not particularly social animals. And so there aren't very many people who know me intimately enough to know that, that know me enough to see me as apathetic to everyday problems, except for one person, and that's my mate, my woman. And there are times like women in general tend to be more like timid or prone to worry, I think, than men in general. It's sexual dimorphism at the psychological level. And so it'll be in the middle of the night and a dog will be barking outside. She'll wake me up. Why is that dog barking? It's like, I don't know why the dog is barking. I don't care why the dog is barking. I got to get up early tomorrow and go to work. Just let me sleep. And that does not sit well with her. Or there's like an engine revving outside, somewhere within 50 meters of our house. It's probably out on the road somewhere, a neighbor's driveway. But, what's that? What is that sound? Are they in our driveway? It's like, I don't know who they are. They're probably out on the road. I don't care who they are. I just want to get some sleep. If somebody actually is trying to break into this house, wake me up, I'll load the Glock and I'll deal with it. But until that happens, if nobody's trying to get into this house, let me sleep. And she has gotten upset with me over this issue before, although now we're living in a different house in a much more controlled neighborhood, because there's like a homeowners association, and everybody's got nice yards. In fact, two of our neighbors actually mow their lawn twice a day. It's just unnatural. But it's quiet here, and we don't have like criminals skulking about and strange dogs or our own dogs barking in the middle of the night. So I guess that would be the closest I would come to the situation. I just don't worry about stuff nearly as much as most people do, I guess. And the woman I love is, that does get on her nerves sometimes because I really am seen as just apathetic or whatever. And I guess I am kind of apathetic about certain things like barking dogs. I mean, I lived in Burma for so long. I was a monk just kind of living at the mercy of the universe. And there's all kinds of weird noises and all kinds of stuff going on. You just can't be bothered with it. I mean, if you're worrying about what is that and, where are they and what are they doing? What are their motives? It's like you're never going to get any sleep. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. This is also from Fenrissen. He says, have you ever visited the temple in Brunswick County, North Carolina? And I haven't even visited the temple here in Greenville County, South Carolina, which is where I live. I was never much into visiting temples, even when I was a monk. In fact, I kind of avoided visiting temples. And I don't know, I'm just not a temple visity kind of person, I guess. So no, I haven't visited any temples on anywhere near the East Coast of the United States. The only temples I've actually visited in the last 30 years have been Theravada Buddhist monasteries that I was either living at or just got invited there for some ceremony with other monks or something. And now that I'm not a monk anymore, I don't get invited to those anymore. And that's fine with me. I mean, I guess there is a Sinhalese monastery of sorts somewhere in this area. Also, there's supposed to be a really pretty Vietnamese temple, which wouldn't be Theravada probably, but it's got really nice gardens and everything, nice architecture and so forth. But I don't know. I'm just not much interested in that sort of thing. I really never have been. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Fituska. I think that's how you pronounce this name. And this is a long question that was even longer. I've edited part of it just to make it more manageable. If you want to read the entire question with all the commentary explaining the question and everything, you can find it in the comments under the YouTube video of Q&A number 98. But Fituska says, I'm working on a research paper on the topic of veterinary ethics concerning differing views to animal euthanasia. Leading Western organizations like the AVMA and the FAWC consider animal euthanasia justified if the animal's life is not worth living. Euthanasia is in the animal's best interests, and the euthanasia is done quickly and painlessly. In practice, however, if a client brings an animal to be put down by a vet for even an ethically questionable reason, 80% of the time the animal is euthanized, even if the act is not in any way in the animal's best interests. There has been, for example, a case where a healthy litter of rabbits have been brought to be euthanized because the breeder thought they had the wrong fur color. Besides animals, this current ethical framework is also damaging to the veterinarians themselves. Around 44% of, for example, Brazil's veterinarians have used mental health services, and the profession has 4 times the suicide rate of the population average. I personally, and many others, think this is alarming, so I was wondering if a Buddhist perspective could bring something positive to the table to perhaps change the profession for the better. Therefore, regarding your experience and knowledge of Buddhist cultures and philosophy, I would greatly appreciate if you could provide any answers, information, or general thoughts to the following questions. And then the first question is, what do Buddhists, monks, and lay people in different Buddhist cultures in, for example, Burma, Japan, or Tibet, think of animal euthanasia and its justification in general? So really the only country or Buddhist culture I can speak of with any considerable experience, anything remotely resembling authority, would be Burma. I've actually met Burmese veterinarians. I've seen them in action in Burma. Dog veterinarians, elephant veterinarians. I've met veterinarians that are Buddhists in Burma, but really no other Buddhist country. So I can't really speak of, say, Japan or Tibet or Thailand. But anyways, from the Buddhist point of view, euthanasia is always bad karma. You're better off avoiding euthanasia. And this is partly, I assume, just partly, not mainly, but partly because when the rules were laid down, when Buddhism arose in ancient India, they didn't have anything remotely resembling the kind of medical technology we've got now. But still, if you, through an act of will, are terminating the life of another being, then you are responsible for that. And in a sense, you have murdered that being. That's, I mean, even with regard to like squishing a bed bug, with regard to deworming yourself with something that kills the worms. I mean, Buddhist ethics are very finely tuned and very uncompromising with regard to certain things. So what do Buddhists in different Buddhist cultures, or in Burma essentially, think of animal euthanasia and its justification in general? Yeah, I mean, as Buddhists, they would have to acknowledge that they're making bad karma by doing it, even if it's done out of compassion. That would be a mitigating factor. So, I mean, there would be some good karma, I suppose, to the extent that you're motivated by compassion, but still there's always going to be at least a little bit of bad karma, even if the animal is in great pain. I mean, from the veterinary point of view, you could just give it like painkillers until it passes away naturally. That would be a more Buddhist approach than euthanizing the animal. But sometimes, I mean, it's not going to be a fast death. You know, they might have some kind of cancer. They can't digest their food properly or something. You know, it might be a while. And I guess, I mean, you could just keep them on painkillers or keep them unconscious until they just die of kidney failure or whatever from not drinking or eating anything. But, I mean, veterinarians in a Buddhist culture, like a Theravada Buddhist culture, they've got more problems than euthanasia. I should bring this up. I mean, the question isn't about this, but even neutering an animal is messing with its karma, and that is bad karma. I think I vaguely remember hearing a story about even Sariputta, who was one of the Buddha's two chief disciples, had some kind of problems that it turned out was karmic complications from him like castrating an animal when he was a farmer in a previous life. So even neutering an animal is considered to be bad karma. And so the standard thing that is done in like Burmese Buddhist communities, like monasteries or just devout Buddhists, they won't euthanize animals and they won't neuter animals. So you wind up with all these scroungy, mangy dogs everywhere that, I mean, they're not living a good life. You know, they're all malnourished and, you know, got sores on their skin from the mange and just dirty and filthy, and it's not a good life. But that's their karma, and interfering with that in a negative way, like by killing them or cutting their balls off or whatever, it's seen as bad karma. Although some people will still do it. You know, it still happens. It's just that from a strictly Buddhist perspective, there's always going to be a certain amount of akusala karma, or bad karma, demerit happening because of it. So I guess I'll just move on to question number 2 here. Do veterinarians, vet monks, and vet lay people in Buddhist countries have stricter or different ethics compared to the West when it comes to animal euthanasia? I'm throwing the possibility of a monk vet existing because there are monk human doctors in, for example, Mongolia. Well, maybe in a place like Sri Lanka, where the Sangha is very, very lax, and you've got monks that are walking around with briefcases, working for salaries and so forth, there may be vet monks, but I never heard of one in Burma. Yeah, I mean, it's against the rules of monastic discipline for a monk to practice medicine, period, or at least for humans. And then elsewhere, it's just as a monk should not be doing any kind of doctoring other than, like, you know, attending to his sick brothers in the monastery, attending them as best he can. But let's see, do veterinarians in Buddhist countries have stricter or different ethics compared to the West when it comes to animal euthanasia? I think they would be more reluctant in general to euthanize an animal simply because of the Buddhist belief that euthanasia is killing. You're still violating the first precept, even if it's euthanasia. There's mitigating factors, in ethics because, you might be motivated by compassion and so forth. But still, you don't get around the fact that you are breaking the first precept by killing an animal, by terminating the life of a conscious being. So I'll just move on to the third question here, which is, having listened through your previous Q&As, you seem to be mostly pro-animal euthanasia, but I've seen way more Buddhists online who are against it. Instead, encourage the dying animal hospice care via pain medication, mantras, and meditation. How do you justify your own point of view? I don't think I've ever actually endorsed animal euthanasia. With regard to people, I've kind of, I've acknowledged that there may be, a very compassionate motive for, somebody, could be a relative, is in severe pain. They're not going to get better. It's a terminal situation. They want to die. So, signing the papers so that the machine gets unplugged or whatever, handing them a loaded pistol and walking away because they ask for it, because they just can't stand it anymore. There are all kinds of pluses and minuses. I can see how everyone has the right to make their own decisions with regard to something along those lines, like killing animals for food, for example. Even the Buddha did not insist that people stop killing animals for food. He pointed out, you're making bad karma when you do it. You're just violating the first precept, and it's not good for you. But still, it's going to happen. It's just a reality, a social reality, that these kind of things are going to happen. And so at the very least, you can try to mitigate the badness of it. So I wouldn't call myself pro-animal euthanasia, although I can understand a situation where an animal is dying and it's in pain. I do think that what is mentioned here later, way more Buddhists online are against euthanasia and instead encourage the dying animal hospice care via pain medication, mantras, and meditation. That would be a more Dharmic way to go about it. Like I already mentioned, you can just give them painkillers until they fade out. That would be more Dharmic from the point of view of just orthodox Theravada Buddhism and probably Mahayana Buddhism as well. So I guess I answered these questions. But a Buddhist veterinarian really is in kind of a pickle, not only because of the euthanasia thing, or putting them to sleep, but neutering also, which is one of the main things that veterinarians do, is just snip balls off of dogs and cats. So they would be making some merit by, curing Fluffy of her disease and bringing her back to her loving family and all that, but also they're making demerit by cutting off Rover's balls or putting some other animal to sleep. And those would seem to be two of the main things that veterinarians do. Especially the neutering thing. So any really devout Buddhist who really wants to keep precepts and so forth would probably do well to avoid a career in veterinary medicine, unless you're just going to put up a sign saying, this clinic does not euthanize or neuter animals. So I guess I answered that question. Really, the Buddhist position in general is just very cut and dried, very clear cut, that euthanizing anybody is still terminating their existence. You'd be better off just keeping them comfortable and peaceful until they fade out on their own. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Austin. And Austin says, my girlfriend keeps pestering me, insisting that rebirth is an unsubstantiated and irrational belief. She also dismisses the idea that karma influences one's next life, as she doesn't believe in rebirth. However, she admits that she believes the Buddha was enlightened, but with the caveat that even enlightened beings can be wrong about some things. Do you have any suggestions on how to address her claims? Well, I mean, I could say that, like I said earlier, that people are just going to believe what they believe, and I mean, trying to persuade them otherwise is usually an exercise in futility, although this is Austin's girlfriend. And I mean, just accepting it as a hypothesis is really not that irrational. Or let's see, what is unsubstantiated and irrational? Well, I mean, you could have her read some of the books of Ian Stevenson, which is trying to come up with empirical evidence supporting rebirth or reincarnation. So I've read a couple of Ian Stevenson's books, and they are really interesting. That there are cases of small children who recall their past lives and are able to come up with information that it's hard to explain how they could have come up with this information before. Or, I mean, there are other ways of explaining it. You could say that they were possessed by a spirit, that it wasn't the kid himself, but that's not the way it's generally explained. People with just strange birthmarks that correlate to accidents that caused their death in the previous life and so forth. Also, just people that are like transgender, who were of the opposite gender of their biological body in the previous life. And that's the main reason why they're transgender, is that they're sort of like transitioning from one gender to the other, and they're like in mid-transition in this life. So yeah, I mean, if you wanted to give her some kind of like empirical evidence, you might want to find some books by Ian Stevenson, who I think he was at the University of Virginia, someplace like that. He specialized in that, coming up with empirical evidence for it. But also, I mean, there's very wise people who endorse rebirth or even remember past lives. Like Neem Karoli Baba sometimes he would meet someone and just tell them about their past life as such and such person, and they'd say, well, this is why you're like this instead of like that. But you could say that they're just culturally conditioned and just accepting without question what their culture accepts without question. So there's no real way to prove that rebirth does or does not happen. So at least she thinks the Buddha was enlightened, so there is that. But probably she, like most Westerners, like almost all Westerners, and an increasing number of Easterners, she probably just accepts without question that physical matter really exists. And so she would probably just have like the biological attitude towards life in general, at least as, what happens to you after you die is then nothing, essentially. So I guess maybe you could try to I don't know. I don't think that it's extremely important to try and change people's beliefs, but I mean, you might want to point out to her that even the existence of physical matter is nowhere near a certainty. I mean, if you want to go that way, there's a book you could certainly find is by George Berkeley. I mean, he was like the founder of like philosophical idealism in the modern West. There's like the three dialogues of Hylas and Philinus, and then I can't remember what the other book is. But he just relentlessly pounds away at the idea that there really is no proof that physical matter even really exists. That this could be all like a dream. So, gosh, I mean, I could keep rambling for another 15 minutes, but I do have to bear in mind that there is a merciless onslaught of questions today. So, my best bet would maybe try and get her a book by Ian Stevenson on case histories that suggest the existence of reincarnation. And I'm just going to move on to Austin's next question here. Why are the 12 links considered unworthy of study if they are found throughout the Sutta Pitaka? Given their presence in various contexts, aren't they likely to date back to the time of the Buddha? Well, the 12 links of dependent co-arising. They're found throughout the Sutta Pitaka, but the thing is, they're found throughout the Sutta Pitaka in the same stock form. It just gets plugged into suttas. Sometimes it's not even supported by the context. Like there's a sutta called the Cosmologist. In my translation of it, it's called the Cosmologist, where you've got this worldly philosopher goes to the Buddha, and maybe it was Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation called it the Cosmologist. I called it the worldly philosopher or something like that. I don't remember now. But anyways, this philosopher goes to the Buddha. He's not, the philosopher himself is not a Buddhist. And he asks the Buddha, well, Mr. Gautama, does the world exist? Or does everything exist? And the Buddha says, everything exists is the first philosophy of the world. And then the philosopher says, well, then does everything not exist? And then the Buddha says, that is the second philosophy of the world. And then the philosopher says, well, is everything plurality? And then the Buddha says, that is the third philosophy of the world. And then the philosopher says, well, then, is it a unity? And then the Buddha says, that is the fourth philosophy of the world. And Buddhism goes by the path, by the middle. It's the middle way between extremes. And then, his approach to that question, whether the world, everything exists or everything doesn't exist, middle path. Or is everything a plurality or everything a unity? Middle path, right between those extremes. And then it just gets plugged in the 12 links, which of course obviously just assumes plurality as real. And it just doesn't fit the context. It doesn't really, whenever you come across the 12 links, it's the exact same formula that just plugged in like blocks into various suttas. That it's sort of like the description of the 4 jhanas is the same way. Almost every time you come across it, it's verbatim the exact same description. That's just like this stock formula that just gets inserted into text. And it may be that they are replacing an older description that was harder to memorize or just fell from, it wasn't in favor anymore, or whatever the reason. But it's fairly obvious that in a lot of suttas anyway, that this stock formula that's always pretty much the same, if not exactly the same, is just plugged in to various suttas. And so I don't think the Buddha would have spoken that way, especially when it doesn't fit the context. So, the 12 links can still be worthy of study. You want to be literate in Theravada Buddhist philosophy. That's the orthodox explanation of dependent co-arising, even though I really don't think that it really is the correct interpretation of dependent co-arising. And you can find certain archaic suttas that show evidence of being very old, that contain like proto 12 links. It's the links are different. Even what's the name of it? The Maha Nidana Sutta? Yeah, the Maha Nidana Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, which is the largest discourse on the subject of dependent co-arising. Even that, it doesn't give the exact same 12 links. It has a slightly different version, apparently because it's a little older. The 12 links had already been developing, had already been evolving ideologically, but they hadn't really settled on this exact 12 links yet. And apparently it was too well known for them to change it and just plug in the stock formula. So, it's still worthy of study if you want to be well-versed in Orthodox Theravada philosophy, at least know what the philosophy says. It's just like it's worth anyone's while in the West to read the Bible, just at the very least to know what it is that you're not accepting. Why reject something if you don't even know what it's saying? So, even if you're going to argue against it, it's best to know what it says so you can argue against it intelligently. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Zenithoid. And Zenithoid just recently joined the Discord server, so welcome Zenithoid. And Zenithoid says, I have some questions about analogs between Buddhist countries in the West. Do Eastern Buddhists say things like, oh Buddha, in the same way that Westerners say, oh my God? And again, the only Buddhist culture that I can really speak of with some authority is Burma. I spent only a few weeks in Thailand, a few weeks in India, few weeks in Japan. So, and I never learned the language of any of the other countries other than Burma. So I know from experience living in Burma for more than 20 years that sometimes, like as an exclamation, people will say, especially women, will say Myasuapia, which is, Myasuapia means like noble lord, which is an epithet for the Buddha. So they would say that just as an exclamation, like calling out to God or something. But I mean, they wouldn't say something like, and I feel kind of a little bit of cringe coming upon me, even in anticipation of what I'm going to say. Is like, go to my Buddha, it's hot out today. You know, they just don't talk that way. And they still have enough reverence for the Buddha that they just wouldn't dare to say something like that. And even I felt a little bit of cringiness saying that just now. So another thing that Burmese people will exclaim, like if they start to slip or lose their balance or something like a loud noise all of a sudden happens, they'll say something like Anesapia, which means impermanence lord. So I mean, it's anicca, impermanence. It has become an exclamation, like an interjection in Burmese. Another one is just Om Malay Pia, which just means like, oh, little mother. But yeah, it's like Buddha hasn't become like an interjection in the same way that Jesus Christ has become an interjection in the West. Just sometimes if somebody is like legit alarmed, they might say, Myasuapia, just in a way, just kind of calling out to God in a moment of crisis or something. And a lot of Burmese people do think Buddha is essentially God. So, yeah, I mean, I really didn't hang out with lay people enough to really do like an anthropological study on expletives and interjections used by Burmese people, but I do know for a fact that Myasuapia is one of the common exclamations made in times of alarm by especially Burmese village ladies. But it's more like a devout calling out to the Buddha rather than just changing the word Buddha into just an interjection that doesn't have any meaning. Like Jesus Christ in for a lot of people in English. So I'll just move on to Zenithoid's next question here. Are there Mara worshippers in the same way that there are Satanists? And I wouldn't be surprised, but I never encountered any, and I don't think I've ever heard of Mara worshippers in Burma. I have read from a Chinese chronicler who went to India back in the medieval times that I think it was near Sawati, or maybe Bodh Gaya. There was a monastery that revered Devadatta instead of Gautama Buddha. That apparently Devadatta's schism wasn't entirely wiped out in the Buddhist time. But that would be more like revering Judas Iscariot as the Messiah rather than Jesus of Nazareth. So yeah, I haven't really heard of Mara worshippers. I mean, there are kind of like black magicians, necromancers and so forth, but I don't think that they are like calling upon Mara to help them. That Mara is, it's kind of strange that Mara is more unequivocally just someone you don't want to mess with in like a Burmese culture than Satan is in the West, even though Satan is just evil, whereas Mara, I mean, if he can't get you to be bad, he'll get you to be good. So it could be that there are some people, they're trying to become rich and famous or something. They might make a deal with Mara or make offerings to Mara, because Mara is essentially the god of samsara. He's not the god of evil and hell so much as he is the god of the entire realm of delusion, especially the sensual realms, which includes our planet. So, yeah, it could be, and there are like black wizards and so forth, and witches and so forth in Burma, but I don't know enough about how black magicians and witches operate to know whether they're actually incorporating Mara, the evil one, into their, their incantations and spells and so forth. So I'll just move on to Zenithoid's third question. What other interesting parallels to Western culture did you notice while in Burma? And the only thing that really comes to mind is that the kind of people that are most likely to be anti-religion are cocky young men. It's kind of what I noticed in the West also, and with regard to religion in general. Although nowadays, religion in general is pretty much in free fall in the West. It used to be that women, being more kind of insecure by temperament, would still kind of cling to religion as a way of guaranteeing that, bad things don't happen to them after they die, at least. Whereas now it's just do whatever you want, largely due to, should I say it, leftist ideology, which is spiritually bankrupt, essentially, as a general rule. There are exceptions. So the people that are most likely to openly mock religion are like guys in their late teens and early 20s, especially if they're rich. I remember one time I was walking down the street in Rangoon, and some big car, it was like a Mercedes, just drives by, and then it stops like half a block ahead, and some young guy rolls down his window and just yells like, "Take it off, motherfucker!" And he was referring to my monk's robes, and he was like offended that a Westerner would actually wear a monk's robe, because probably he was like the son of a general or somebody, lived a life of privilege and ease, was just rich without having to do anything, sort of maybe a Hunter Biden type. And he could offend anybody and there would be no consequences. He could just break a law. He could run somebody over with that car. Chances are he wouldn't get in trouble for it. Just because if he's the son of a general or some, colonel that's in the government or something, the police would just be scared shitless of causing any trouble for this guy, because it's a corrupt system like America is increasingly becoming. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Rinchen. And Rinchen says, there are many texts in Buddhist tantric literature describing sacred prostitutes. Some of them were enlightened Mahasiddhas, highly regarded in these tantras and Dzogchen Mahamudra texts. Do you think prostitution can be a way of life compatible with Dharma? Doesn't it fall under the sexual misconduct, wrong livelihood, and craving categories? Well, in Theravada Buddhism, yeah, it would be violation of the third precept or sensual misconduct. Sexual promiscuity would definitely qualify as sensual misconduct. But even so, prostitution was pretty obviously legal in the Buddhist time. It didn't have as much stigma to it as in the West nowadays. Now, prostitution is almost obsolete in the West now, as far as I can tell, because most women just give it away for free. But, for example, one of the Buddha's final meals was offered to him by Ambapali, who was a Padesa Kalyani, or the beauty of the land. And apparently what happened in ancient India, at least in the Ganges Valley in the Buddhist time, was that like a city council would hire this beautiful prostitute to entertain dignitaries coming to town and so forth. And that was the Padesa Kalyani. And Ambapali was one of these. And the Buddha accepted a meal from her. There was no problem with that. And she did convert to Buddhism and became a nun. And according to the Therigatha, she became fully enlightened. And her Ambapali's verses in the Therigatha are some of the most beautiful verses in the book, some of the most memorable. I think Jivaka the doctor, the Buddha's personal physician, was the son of a prostitute like that also. But still, it is considered to be, it's a wrong livelihood. It's sensual misconduct. But it's not as bad as being like an executioner, being a bandit, something like that. It's what is it? Immorality of a rather harmless character, relatively speaking. So I have read that some bodhisattvas in Mahayana Buddhism have been prostitutes, but there's no mention of. Ambapali is probably the best regarded prostitute in Theravada Buddhism. So, yeah, it'd be sort of like a veterinarian who euthanizes animals, even though the animals are in pain or something. Still, just you're not supposed to do it. You're going to be making a certain amount of unskillful, unwholesome karma by doing it, regardless of any good stuff that tries to compensate for that. There's always going to be that little bit of poison mixed in. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Ruhe. And I think my nostrils are improving. I'm not having the same nostril problem I had over the last 3 Q&As. So Ruhe says, did you ever experience sensation without pain or pleasure, aversion or attachment during meditation for sustained periods of even brief flashes? Well, I'm not exactly sure what Ruhe is getting at, because, if you're doing meditation on the breath, as a general rule, the sensation of touch at your nostrils when the air is going in and out is really devoid of pain or pleasure. Most of what you're noting when you're sitting in meditation, unless you got like a knee screaming in agony, is going to be without pain or pleasure. So I think maybe Ruhe is sort of indirectly asking if I got to a certain level in jhana where I wasn't feeling pain or pleasure, but still, if you're meditating well, then you're just observing whatever sensations are arising, and for the most part, they're going to be neutral sensations, just like the air going in and out of your nostrils, or the feeling of swallowing your own slobber, or the feeling of your clothing against your skin, or like the ticking of a clock. That's not pleasant or unpleasant, unless you're especially bothered by ticking clocks. I had a roommate in college that was like that. He just hated the sound of ticking clocks for some reason. So, yeah, with regard to jhana, I wouldn't venture to try and like figure out here like what level I got to, but there are lots of times, and it seems like most of the time, whenever you're not like in an intensive situation where you've got like this problem knee or problem ankle or problem hip joint that is just screaming at you whenever after you've been sitting for 15 minutes. Plus, of course, sometimes you get like bed sores on your behind just from sitting so much, and that hurts too. So, let's see. Did you ever experience sensation without pain or pleasure during meditation? Yeah, I guess just the honest, simple answer is yes, because, for example, you're doing anapana, just observing the sensation of touch of the air at your nostrils. That's neither painful nor pleasurable as a general rule. So I think I might be misunderstanding the question, but I'm moving on to the next one anyway, which is from Yuga'u. And this is kind of a weird one that I don't think I can fully answer. Who is more wiser, Master Oogway of Kung Fu Panda or Master Yoda? And the thing is, I've never seen Kung Fu Panda in my life. Is it a cartoon? Sounds like a cartoon. They might have done like a live action special effects movie version of it. But I would just assume if it is a cartoon, then yeah, I think there is like this law that cartoon characters cannot be fully enlightened. That even if you have like a cartoon Buddha in anime, he's going to be a very unimpressive enlightened being. and it's just not going to be persuasive or convincing at all. So, I mean, having to choose between a character from Kung Fu Panda that I've never seen or Yoda from the Star Wars, the rapidly dying Star Wars series, I'd have to go with Yoda. And I do know a certain thing about Yoda, that George Lucas came from, I can't remember, he came from like the Central Valley of California, not far from Stockton. And in Stockton, the Cambodian Sangha Raja in exile was living in Stockton at a Cambodian monastery. He was over 100 years old at the time. And so George Lucas sent a camera team and some other people to this Cambodian monastery in Stockton, California. And they were observing and recording the behavior and speech of this Cambodian Sangha Raja. And they based Yoda on this old Cambodian Theravada Buddhist monk. And in fact, the word Yoda in Pali means warrior. So he was like the Dharma warrior. And so, I mean, at least Master Yoda is based on, I mean, I'd be skeptical if the Cambodian Sangha Raja was fully enlightened, but at least he had cultivated some wisdom. And he was a more than 100 years old Theravada Buddhist monk, the highest ranking Buddhist monk in Cambodia, although he was living in exile at the time. So, yeah, I would just have to guess Yoda would be wiser than Master Oogway of Kung Fu Panda. So I'm just moving on to Yuga-U's next question here. Can you please explain why for some being in jhana is good and for some is wrong? And then in parentheses, he's got Ajahn Sona said it's good to abide in jhana. That is the highest bliss. Yet in suttas, we must be mindful of them too. Well, I mean, jhana isn't necessarily the highest bliss if you consider nibbana to be higher than jhana. And it's the highest bliss even though you're not actually feeling feelings. It's the highest bliss just because there's no more dukkha, there's no more suffering. But, I mean, the only teachers I know of who say that you should avoid jhana are vipassana teachers, like the Mahasi method. Teachers of the Mahasi method sometimes will teach people, just don't bother with jhana. You can get enlightened from practicing satipatthana mindfulness, that jhana is dangerous, that you can get psychic powers that will then lead you astray. You just get distracted by all the fireworks and bells and whistles. You're better off just doing nice, dry, plain mindfulness. And that's really not what the suttas say. I mean, according to the suttas, the 4 jhanas are right concentration. Sama Samadhi. You read the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, which is like the Bible for mindfulness meditators, and it defines Sama Samadhi, or right concentration, the 8th step of the Eightfold Path, as jhana, the 4 jhanas. So, yeah, it's like being in jhana is good. It's temporary liberation. It's like what the first 7 steps of the Eightfold Path are leading to, at least in some explanations of the Eightfold Path. So, yeah, the Buddha never warned anybody to avoid jhana, that you're better off getting jhana because that's right concentration. So, see, I don't fully understand this last phrase here, yet in the suttas we must be mindful of them too. Mindful of the suttas themselves? Yeah, I mean, there will be times when you're not in jhana, and then you can study texts and so forth. And when you come out of jhana, that's when insight can arise. Because, I mean, I really don't think that the Buddha originally taught 2 entirely different paths. One was vipassana, and the other one was samatha or jhana. Concentration versus mindfulness. Because, I mean, 4th jhana is called purity of mindfulness in the stock description. And a lot of descriptions of insight that is arises after the person comes out of jhana. They come out of this really profound state, start thinking again, and that's when the insight can arise. So, yeah, I don't think that jhana is wrong for anybody. That's just something that certain teachers of like Vipassana will tell you, just because they prefer their Vipassana mindfulness meditation and don't want you to be led astray and do some other technique that they don't teach. And so I'm going to move on to the next question, also from Yoga, who says, last time you said most of us will be reborn back as humans. Can you please explain what tendencies cause rebirth as humans and what for animals? Well, animalistic tendencies would be more conducive to being reborn as an animal. So like rage or even like fear, just really basic animal emotions, if they really kind of take you over, especially if you die in a state that's just like an animal mind. Maybe you're just really bad things are happening to you and you're just totally freaked out and you're just kind of like gone into like basic animal mode, then that might help you, helping, I guess, to be reborn in an animal realm. Some such, just going with the theory. Although I am somewhat skeptical as to how easy it is for a human to be reborn as an animal, simply because animals have much simpler minds than we've got. And I don't see how all of the karma, which is mental states, are going to fit into the mind of like a dog. Maybe a dog. Dogs are, they're kind of semi-human. We've got convergent evolution. So dogs are kind of semi-human, but like a rat or a cow or something, it would be like most of your karma would just have to be going to like a state of dormancy. It just have to just be dormant while you're living this entire life. But most people, as I said earlier, they're assuming rebirth really exists. You're probably going to be reborn as a human. People who remember their past lives generally remember being a human and not being like an elephant or something. Although there are cases of that also in Burma, probably Thailand also. So the tendencies that cause rebirth as humans would be human tendencies. Just being a human, just being a normal human will cause you to be reborn as a normal human probably. And like I said, with animals, it'd be like the really animalistic, bestial kind of mental states, not necessarily violent, even something like fear or just, hunger or something might possibly kind of land you. I mean, if they were strong enough, just land you in an animal existence where those kind of mental states are predominant, something like that. But I'm no authority on how to get reborn as an animal. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Billy Crows. And Billy Crows says, how important is it as a lay practitioner to have a teacher? Well, it's helpful. It's definitely helpful. It's not absolutely necessary. But I mean, having a human teacher, that is. I mean, you may have a teacher that's not on the physical plane that you're not fully aware of consciously, or it's just like your own karma is guiding you to just finding the right book or even finding the right YouTube video nowadays that will teach you what you need to know. I mean, if you got the karma for it, like the saying I said earlier, when the student is ready, the teacher will come. And the teacher won't necessarily come in a human body. So how important is it as a lay practitioner to have a teacher? If you can find a good one, then yeah, go for it. If you can't find a good one, then you got to just do the best you can without one. So I'm just going to move on to Billy Crow's next question here. If no suitable teacher can be found, what are the most important practices for one to exercise in order to stay on the path? Well, read the text. Like when the Buddha died, according to tradition, he said that after he is gone, the Dharma will be your teacher. So read Dharma books, especially if you're a Theravada Buddhist, then read Pali texts, read suttas. But there are a lot of teachers out there, and some of them are very good. Some of them are possibly enlightened. There have been a number of beings that are very wise that may have been fully enlightened that have lived recently enough that you can have books consisting of their sermons or lectures or Dhamma talks or whatever. So the most the most important practices for one to exercise in order to stay on the path. Yeah, I mean, the best thing would be to read Dhamma books, like Pali texts, in order to know what the path is so that it's easier to stay on it. I mean, it's hard to stay on the path if you don't even know for sure what the path is. So that's right view. That's the very first step of the Noble Eightfold Path. I mean, it's good to know what the path is in order for you to follow the path correctly. And then just, there are a lot of wise teachers out there who know a lot about Dhamma. Just read their books, possibly, watch YouTube videos. Although YouTube videos are going to be much more recent with regard to the information. Books are going to go back, well over 100 years. And I got a dog having a weird dream again. You still having that weird dream? Stop it. Okay, so let's see. So that's, for me also, like most of my life, most of my most important teachers have been books. Like one of my very first teachers, aside from my father, was Ram Dass, just from being given Ram Dass books to read. That's really what turned me on to Eastern philosophy. How you doing? You want to say hi to everybody? Tater says hi. Look at the camera. Tater says hi. Okay. All right, back down. Let's see here. Most important practices. If you know like basic meditation, you can do that. And I'll just keep basic morality, self-restraint, maybe a little austerity, a little renunciation. And then you can learn how to do that stuff properly by reading books if you don't have a human teacher. So I'm just going to move to Billy Crow's third question here. In this era where information is so readily available, is it sufficient to use internet resources and books if no teacher has yet been found? I just belched. No disrespect to Billy Crow's for belching at the conclusion of his question here. It's just a biological process that occasionally occurs, especially when I do Q&A videos. So, let's see. Yeah, I guess I've already answered this one. If since information is so readily available, we are living in the information age. We're no longer in the space age because we've lost the technology, supposedly, and it's just too expensive. And we're too much in debt to be sending rocket ships to Mars or any such thing. So we're stuck in the information age now, which is actually kind of a good thing. I mean, it really is a blessing to have. It's like a psychic power where the internet, it's like another sense faculty. The computer is the sense organ, and then through that sense organ you have access to practically infinite information. Anything you want to know, you can just look it up as a general rule. So, is it sufficient to use internet resources and books if no teacher has yet been found? Well, you do the best you can. I mean, you can learn from anything. I mean, a wise person who is receptive, who's looking for truth, looking for wisdom, can find it just about anywhere. You can get insight from watching a dog lick its balls. I've got insight from watching chickens. So, yeah, I mean, you take it where you can get it. You just accept wisdom wherever you can find it. So, and we've got a lot of access to it on the internet. And any of you who are watching this or listening to this have some access to the internet, because that's where you found me. So, yeah, is it sufficient to use internet? Well, I mean, it's sufficient enough. If it's the best you can do, then it's sufficient enough for the time being. Just do the best you can and find wisdom wherever you can find it. Just going out into a forest and just sitting there peacefully, and wisdom can just kind of soak into you spontaneously. So, we are approximately 3/4 of the way through this, and it's almost 2.5 hours. Yeah, I told you. I tried to warn you. This is going to possibly be the longest Q&A, and if people are asking lots of questions before the next Q&A, and then I do the next Q&A live, and people are asking even more questions on the thing, yeah, it could be an all-day, it could be a marathon. Anyways, this next question is from Bodhisattva 969. And he says, what is the best way to address monks and samaneras, regardless of whether it is a Thai monk or one from Myanmar? And if you do not know exactly how many rainy seasons the monk has, well, with regard to monks, you can call them Bhante. Just any Theravada Buddhist monk will know what Bhante means. It doesn't matter if he's a junior monk or a senior monk. If you're a layperson, he's going to outrank you anyway. And so call him Bhante. That's Pali. So, in different countries, like in Burma, most people would call a monk a Shinpaya, which means like venerable lord. But in Thailand, of course, they're going to be saying something in Thai, and Sinhalese, they're going to be saying something in Sinhalese. So, yeah, Bhante is just universal for like venerable sir. But with regard to samaneras, novices, yeah, maybe just call them samanera, because you wouldn't call a samanera Bhante, and mostly I think they would go by the language of their culture. Like in Burma, you call them Koyen. I've heard people calling, like some ladies calling a novice over, she'll just say Koyen, which means novice. So I don't think that would be completely disrespectful, especially since samaneras mostly are kids anyway. So, yeah, the best way to address monks, just regardless of country, in Theravada Buddhism, this wouldn't work for like Mahayana monks probably, but Bhante, Bhante, and probably just call them samanera for the samaneras. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from 5 Precept Pete. And 5 Precept Pete says, after ordaining as a monk and before you had a handle on the Vinaya, what was the first rule you broke? Before I had a handle on the Vinaya? After ordaining as a monk and before I had a handle, what was the first rule I broke? The very first one? Gosh, it was probably some rule that I wasn't aware I was breaking, since I didn't really have a handle on the Vinaya. One rule that I was breaking early was traveling with women, because sometimes the monastery attendant would be female, and she'd be driving the monks somewhere, and they'd say, get in the car, and I'd say, okay, and then I'd be breaking a rule, a Pachitya rule in the Patimokkha for traveling by arrangement with a woman. But the first rule that I broke, that's hard to say, because there's lots and lots of rules, and you can break certain rules really easily. No, maybe the very first rule I broke was, according to the commentary, I mentioned this in the previous Q&A, that for a monk to make use of anything that has been bought, at least in part with monk's money, he's committing a dukkha offense, an offense of wrongdoing, by making use of what was paid for by monk's money. And in all likelihood, almost certainly, some monks had helped to pay for the property that monks were donating to pay off the property. So even at my ordination ceremony, as I was being ordained, the moment I became an ordained monk, I broke a rule for making use of that property that had been paid for partly with monk's money. So that would probably be it. Yeah, I guess that would be it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA. And PSA says, I kissed a girl who has a boyfriend. The situation was escalating towards sex, but I stopped it because I was trying to keep the 3rd precept. After this incident, I initially thought that I had acted rightly by preventing the act of sex, but now I'm thinking about it and I'm wondering if I broke the 3rd precept anyway because we kissed. Sometimes I feel guilty, and I wonder if I'm feeling guilty unnecessarily. Could you please be as specific as you can about the 3rd precept? What is and what is not sexual misconduct? Please, it will help many people to know where to draw the line and keep their sila. Okay, well, for starters, there's this statement here in the middle saying, sometimes I feel guilty and I wonder if I'm feeling guilty unnecessarily. Of course you are, because all feeling of guilt is unnecessary. That I have said this many times, that if you know only 2 things about Dhamma, just 2 things. One is that all suffering is caused by desire. Whenever you're unhappy, it's because you want something. And 2, a guilty conscience, remorse, regret are always bad karma. They always just fuck things up worse than they already are. They don't help. I mean, they can indirectly help by encouraging you not to do the same thing, but you can make the resolution not to do it again without having to feel the guilt and remorse and regret and so forth. So, yeah, anyone who feels guilty is feeling guilty unnecessarily, and they'd be better off not feeling guilty. I mean, acknowledging that you did something wrong, fine. And then, like, making a resolution or just making this intention in your mind to do better and not make the same mistake, that's excellent. That's the best you can do. And then try to compensate by doing lots of good to compensate for any bad that you did. That's about the best you can do, aside from just becoming fully enlightened. So, getting back to the question in general, PSA here, kissed a girl who has a boyfriend, that rascal. And he didn't have sex with her. And according to the orthodox explanations of the third precept of sexual misconduct, kami su michachara, it is with regard to actual sex. So just kissing a girl, even if like maybe thrusting your tongue in and out rhythmically into her mouth, then still it's not the same as having actual sex with her. So technically you would not have broken the rule. But still, I mean, you got to bear in mind that rules or precepts on the one hand and actual morals on the other are entirely different. That some rules, they've got a moral basis. Other rules don't have a moral basis, but still it's the mental states, not the outward actions, that have the moral quality, that are creating karma that's either wholesome or unwholesome. So, I mean, kissing the girl, especially if you knew she already had a boyfriend, I mean, you may not be breaking the third precept, but still you're probably doing something that you shouldn't oughta. So the best thing you can do, just try to do better, and just acknowledge that you did something you shouldn't ought to have done, which apparently you've already done. I mean, the admitting it, not the doing it. And then avoid doing that in future. And don't feel remorse or regret. I tried to say remorse and regret at the same time, and it came out remort. Let's see. What am I missing here? Feeling guilty unnecessarily. Yeah, I think I pretty much answered that question. That technically, kamisu michachara is with regard to actual sex, which would probably include oral sex, but not include just mouth-to-mouth contact. But even so, you got to acknowledge or bear in mind that whether you technically broke the rule or not, that is not determining whether you're making good karma or bad karma. That's internal, that's mental states. So it is possible for, a person to not break a rule and still be bad, and another person to be good and still break a rule. Let's see here. Yeah, I don't think you technically broke the third precept, even though you may have been somewhat rascally in your conduct. So, yeah, with regard to the third precept, if you read the orthodox explanation, first of all, it's geared towards men. And it's just this list of 10 different kinds of female that you're not allowed to have sex with. And all 10 kinds are women that are already under the guardianship or protection of a man. So it's like a girl still living with her parents. You're not supposed to have sex with her. A woman who's just living under a guardian. A woman who's married. A woman who's engaged. A woman who's betrothed to be engaged. Another man's slave girl. I think even a prostitute, considering that she's pretty much a slave of her pimp. A female inmate at a prison who's under the guardianship of the prison guards. There's a couple more, I think. But it's kind of a weird explanation that, it doesn't really apply to women. So, what's a woman going to do if she's going to try and keep the third precept? So there must be other explanations of the third precept. And mainly it's like, you don't have to be married to avoid breaking the third precept when you have sex. So long as it's like a monogamous relationship and you sincerely care for each other, then you're doing okay. Buddhist ethics are such that, it's impossible to have sex without some kind of lust and passion and so forth, which can be very pleasant, but still, from just the uncompromising, hard-ass perspective of Buddhist ethics, you're just probably better off celibate. Now, for sure you are, if you can manage that. But if you can't manage it, stay away from the wives of other men, stay away from other men's girlfriends. Having sex with a woman who's still like living with her parents, gosh, that's, I guess if you're like in your 40s, then yeah, you should definitely stay away from girls still living with their parents. But I think that would be a more useful definition of the third precept than just having a list of the kinds of women you're not allowed to have sex with. Promiscuous sex just for pleasure is out. Adultery is out. But if you're in like a monogamous relationship with someone you sincerely care about, you love each other, then you don't even have to be married. It's still not in violation of the third precept. So I guess I answered that one. So I'm just going to move on to the next one, which is from Mo in the Middle. And Mo in the Middle says, can you please talk what Buddha said about perception and how important is in our lives and practice? Well, perception is samsara. Perception is what delusion. That is the origin of samsara, is just perception, or papancha, where you're dividing the world up into parts that you consider to be separate from each other, and just creating this entire world of, like in the Tao Te Ching, it's the 10,000 things. So, you can have good perception, at least, like at a crude level. Some perceptions are better than others. If you're having a perception of compassion or kindness, that's better than a perception of hate or, wanting to just mess somebody up. But still, ultimately, unenlightenment is essentially perception. Samsara is essentially perception. So, see what the Buddha said about perception and how important it is in our lives. So the best thing you can do is just try to have the most wholesome perceptions that you can manage, or neutral ones. Try to have as few negative, unwholesome perceptions as you can manage. And then gradually, ideally, a renunciant will wean himself off of perception altogether. Still after you're enlightened, it will be as though you have perceptions, but the perceptions will no longer, you won't be identifying with them or considering them to be real. You won't be like enslaved to your beliefs the way an unenlightened being is. So, I guess I'll just move on to Mo in the Middle's next question, which is, what would religious people use to base their morality and ethics if there was no God? Well, Buddhism has very finely tuned, very subtle ethics, and God has nothing to do with it. The gods, the small g gods, are just as bound to the workings of ethics as any other conscious being in the universe. And the way it works is ethics are based on psychology. That there are certain mental states that will cause you to be more unhappy and farther away from enlightenment, and other mental states that will cause you to be more happy and closer to enlightenment. So what is moral is what causes you to be more happy and closer to enlightenment. What is immoral is what causes you to be less happy and farther away from enlightenment. And certain actions, just because of human psychology, it's just built into us. Certain kinds of actions are going to cause us to be happier. And I mean, not just having fun or feeling pleasure, but like more at ease, fewer desires, which all suffering is caused by desire, cause us to have fewer desires, just more in harmony with our surroundings, more love and compassion for others, fewness of desires, just closer to enlightenment. There's certain actions that reinforce those mental states. Certain other actions, it's virtually impossible to do them without just yanking yourself away from the path of Dharma and just setting yourself up for misery and trouble. Like Lizzie Borden axe murdering her parents. There's no way you can do that with wholesome mental states. There's no way you can do that without having lasting karmic effects that are just going to be messing with you at least for the rest of your life, possibly for many lives. So, base your morality and ethics. If there's no God, it's just Buddhist ethics is based on mental states. So whatever action promotes mental states that are peaceful and content and closer to enlightenment, that's moral, that's ethical. And the ones that take you farther away from that are immoral or unethical. And technically, the term in Pali is kusala for good and akusala for bad. Kusala literally means skillful, and akusala means unskillful. So ethics, it's not so much that you're being punished by some being up in heaven or something for what you did. You know, they made this law that you're not allowed to point at a pregnant cow with your finger. I think that's actually in the laws of Manu, that a Brahmin isn't allowed to point with his finger towards a pregnant cow. So some god declares that that's immoral for you to do that, and then he's going to smite you if you actually dare to point at a pregnant cow. So it doesn't work that way. It's just like if you do something with good mental states, and I guess it's a kind of circular reason to say good mental states. So going back with what I've been saying, mental states that are conducive to peace and contentment and fewness of desires and getting you closer to liberating wisdom, then that is moral just by definition. That's just how it works. And certain actions are more conducive to going in that direction, and other actions are more conducive to going in the opposite direction. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm going to move on to Mo in the Middle's third question here. If arahants are free from any violation and they have no need to help or interfere with humans around them, then would you say that ethics are purely samsaric idea like anything else? Ethics is purely samsaric. That when you become enlightened, not only have you left evil behind, you've left the entire duality of good and evil. So it used to be like in Burma when I was a monk. Monks would be like, I wouldn't bow to statues as a general rule. I'm just not into idolatry much. And so I would just sit there. Other monks would bow to the statue. I wouldn't bow to the statue. And then they'd say, you get merit if you bow to that statue. And I'd say, merit is for lay people. Because a monk is supposed to he's not only supposed to abandon badness, he's supposed to abandon good and evil, goodness and badness. It's a kind of lawful neutral, using Dungeons and Dragons jargon. So, yeah, ethics, it's part of the raft made of rubbish that you use to cross the flood, or at least an awareness and skillful navigation of ethics is part of the raft made of rubbish that helps you to cross the flood. Once you get to the other side, you just throw the raft away. You don't need it anymore. So, an enlightened being isn't making any karma, and ethics are really a matter of karma, skillful and or unskillful. And since an enlightened being isn't making karma anymore, he's not generating any more karma, then ethics no longer really apply to him. Although, according to Orthodox tradition, arahants would just naturally live a moral life. They wouldn't be going around, killing and stealing and drinking and whoring. So, let's get back to this question here. I think I distracted my little distracted myself a little with the mention of drinking and whoring. So let's see here. If arahants are free from any violation and they have no need to help or interfere with humans around them, then would you say that ethics are purely samsaric idea like anything else? Yeah, it's purely samsaric, but still it is very valid within the context of samsara. So long as we are stuck in samsara, so long as we are not enlightened yet, we should take ethics seriously. It's like gravity or something. Gravity is purely samsaric. Time is purely samsaric. It's not ultimately real. But still, so long as we are living in this version of reality with gravitational forces and the passage of time and also the validity of ethics, then we should be good boys and girls instead of bad boys and girls, or at least neutral boys and girls. And with that, I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Extremely Rare Bird. An Extremely Rare Bird says, I remember you said something like easy times create weak men. Do you think healthy masculinity and femininity is generally doomed in spoiled consumeristic and hedonistic cultures of today? Well, yeah, it's part of the cycle of history. That it says hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create bad times. That's the cycle of history. And of course, we are now in the stage of weak men creating bad times. So, the question is, do you think healthy masculinity and femininity is generally doomed in spoiled consumeristic and hedonistic cultures of the day? Well, a spoiled consumeristic and hedonistic culture doesn't necessarily destroy healthy masculinity and femininity. Like, say, in 18th century France, under Louis XIV, it was pretty hedonistic and worldly and so forth, but they still had they had like traditional ideas that men are like this and women are like this, and you could tell the difference. I mean, you could ask somebody who's wanting to become a Supreme Court judge, what is a woman? And they'd be able to answer you easily. It wouldn't be controversial. But the thing is, it's not so much consumerism and hedonism in the West that is destroying healthy masculinity and femininity. It's more a matter of liberalism, leftism, and feminism that is just feminizing society, trying to make everybody not only equal, but the same. Just trying to make everybody the same, just because a lot of leftists are too simple-minded to realize that you don't have to be the same in order to be equal. But it's toxic masculinity if boys, for example, act like boys, and women are trying to become more like men, and they want men to become more like women. At least at an ideological level, they want men to become more like women, even though when the men do become more like women, they don't like that either. So, yeah, it's more a matter of leftism and feminism more than consumerism and hedonism that is pretty much wrecking the duality of masculinity and femininity. And a strong society will have a clear-cut distinction between men and women. It's not going to be controversial. It's even the whole idea that has taken over, that the difference between being a man and a woman is how you feel. That's a result of feminism. It's like women are more likely to identify with their feelings. Men are more likely to identify with their thoughts and with a certain amount of objectivity and rationality. And so science, for example, is pretty much of a masculine pursuit. Even though a lot of women might get into science, still, it's more of a masculine point of view. And when you start preferring feelings to actual empirical evidence like DNA, then you're getting into a more of a feminine approach. And it's doomed to eventual self-destruction. It's like if you, if you build a bridge based on feelings, how certain feminized people feel that bridge ought to be, and just ignore the traditionally masculine engineering problems involved, then it's easily predictable what's going to happen on that bridge is going to collapse. And it's already happened. I think it was like some university I read about, they had proudly had the first bridge constructed by an all-female team of engineers, and the thing collapsed. I mean, it could have been purely coincidence, an act of God or something. I don't know. I just remembered that. Stream of consciousness. So, I guess I answered this question. So I guess I'll just move on to part 2 of this question by Extremely Rare Bird, which is, what about in more Dharma-oriented cultures? Healthy masculinity and femininity in more Dharma-oriented cultures? Yeah, I'm not really sure. I think the healthy masculinity and femininity is more of a worldly kind of a thing than a dharmic kind of a thing. I mean, you could have a Dharma-oriented culture that had almost no sexual dimorphism, with the men and the women being very similar to each other. And like in Burma, I mean, trans people are relatively common, even out in remote villages in just very conservative traditionalist Burma, that trans people are accepted. Maybe a little bit of sniggering behind their back sometimes, but still, they're accepted, and nobody is like giving them a hard time or anything. Not on purpose. And it's just because it's part of the Dharmic culture that, like I was mentioning a ways earlier, you can have a person who's transitioning from male to female over multiple lives, and they're just kind of in an intermediate stage. And so it's easily explainable from a Buddhist point of view why somebody would be trans. Yeah, it'd be more of a survival-oriented culture. Ancient Rome, for example. I mean, like really ancient, like early Republican Rome. They had clear-cut distinction. Men should be like this, women should be like this, and if you don't fit the category, then there's something wrong with you, and you might be ostracized from society. And it made for a very stable structure that became a very strong structure, so that Rome conquered most of the known world at the time. So, yeah, I don't think that consumeristic and hedonistic cultures necessarily undermine healthy masculinity and femininity. And I don't think that Dharma-oriented cultures necessarily reinforce like clear-cut distinctions between masculinity and femininity. I do think it's more of a pragmatic approach to survival and strength that results in clear-cut distinction between masculine and feminine. A clear-cut distinction between masculine and feminine does seem, historically at least, to be conducive to the prosperity of a civilization. So we started off that way, and now we don't have it anymore, and we're kind of in decline now. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Mary J. And Mary J says, is that some kind of English koan? Why did the chicken cross the road? No, it's not an English koan. A koan is a question that has no answer, that nevertheless you are required to answer anyways. Whereas this is a riddle that does have a correct answer. And the correct answer of why did the chicken cross the road is that it presented state's evidence. Although there are some heretics who say that the chicken crossed the road because Colonel Sanders was chasing him, but they are heretics and are worthy of pity. So the chicken crossed the road because it turned state evidence. And that's final. But a koan does not have a correct answer, but you have to answer anyway. And that helps to just kind of break down the intellect so that you become less enslaved to your intellect. It's like you're trying to answer this koan, trying and trying and trying. What is the sound of one hand clapping? How do you know your Buddha nature from the sound of a chirping cricket? And no matter what you tell the Zen master, he just hits you with the stick. Says, go back and meditate some more. And then finally, it's like your mind just kind of snaps or breaks, and then it just leaves like this crystal clarity behind, and that's your insight. And then when whatever comes out of your mouth, when you've got that kind of insight going, is like a correct answer. So the chicken crossed the road. Yeah, it's a totally different kind of a thing. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Avenity. And Avenity says, does being a Buddhist affect your relationships with people in any particular way? The only really noticeable way, well, there's two noticeable ways, I guess. With regard to people in general, some people might just think that I'm kind of weird and interesting because I used to be a monk that lived in caves in Asia for many years. So, I mean, that would kind of affect the relationship because, they have this idea in their head, this guy's kind of weird and interesting, so that's going to have some effect. But then also, it's like I was talking about earlier, where somebody asked if me being a Buddhist causes me to seem apathetic to other people. And I said, only with my woman. And so that affects my relationships with her, I think, is just my years of training in this otherworldly kind of unhuman kind of attitude that, it doesn't really sit well with people sometimes. But she's the only person who really knows me intimately enough at present to really have that be a factor, I think, because I'm generally pretty much of a loner, and so is she. So I guess I answered that question. So now I move on to a very strange question from Outer Haven, which is, does watching futanari mean you are gay? And futanari, for those of you who are innocent of these things, it's a kind of Japanese hentai or like erotic cartoons showing a beautiful woman who nevertheless has male genitalia. So, I mean, in a way, it's sort of like the anime or hentai version of she-males, which is like the porn name for trans women who, even though they look like a hottie, ideally, still they've got male genitalia. And I actually wrote a blog post about this, which is still on my blog. It hasn't been taken down or anything, about gun girls, she-males, and futanari, I think is the title of it. And the only way I don't think that watching futanari means that you're gay necessarily. Some gay guys might be into it, but the only way it would work for me, I'm no connoisseur of this kind of stuff, but still, I mean, I have seen it before. And the only way that it can really work is if the person looks enough like a real woman, a biological woman, that you perceive them as a woman. It's a woman who has a dick, but still you perceive in your mind, this is a woman. And in a way, it's like, did somebody just puke back there? Sorry about that. I think one of my dogs was sounding like he was puking, or she, I should say. But anyways, getting back to what are you doing? Stop it. No, don't puke on the rug. Yeah, one of the dogs is retching. So anyways, getting back to futanari and she-males and so forth, it's like the most erotic part of a woman's body is pretty much her entire body, except maybe her genitalia, because they're internal and you don't see much. Whereas the sexiest part of a male's body is his genitalia. Like when people watch pornography, mainly the only two things they're looking at is the woman's body and the man's penis, and like what they're doing together. So in a way, like she-males and futanari are just combining the two sexiest aspects of this particular situation into one person. And in a way, it kind of, for some people at least, it kind of magnifies the sexuality of the person. And I compared that with gun girls. There's also this genre of like sexy girls in bikinis or maybe naked shooting guns. They've got like machine guns or pistols or whatever it is. And it's kind of the same thing. It's like you've got this woman in possession of this kind of masculine, powerful, phallic kind of a thing that in a way accentuates her femininity. And I think to some degree, for some people, she-males and futanari can be something similar in that way, in a strange way. But this Futanari is about as far away from actual Dharma as I think I've strayed in these Q&As. I guess somebody asked me about pogs in a previous Q&A. Oh, my golly. I think I better move on to the next question. This is from Robin's Nest. And Robin's Nest says, I would like to know your opinion on the overall conception of what constitutes as slandering the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha within the Theravada tradition. Coming from a Mahayana background, there is quite a bit of reading material on how dreadful, terrifying, and enormous the hell realms are in Mahayana literature. One of the gravest of all offenses is slandering the triple jewel, which can send one to Naraka or hell. What is the Theravada tradition's stance on slandering the triple jewel, including its penalties? Well, I think slander would be deliberately lying, but it could just mean just misrepresenting the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. And there's not a whole lot of talk about it that I can recall in the text, other than there are two Patimokkha rules with regard to misrepresenting the Buddha. And in that, it's like the point at issue is if a monk is claiming that what the Buddha called stumbling blocks to living a dharmic life really aren't stumbling blocks, then he's misrepresenting the Buddha, and he should be admonished up to 3 times. And if he refuses to change his point of view with regard to this, then there's supposed to be like a formal act of censure against him, or I can't remember the exact formal act that's to be done against him, but it's relatively serious, because he's like stubbornly, obstinately insisting on misrepresenting the Buddha. And what is called a stumbling block, when a monk says what the Buddha calls a stumbling block in Dhamma, or an obstacle, a hindrance, isn't really a stumbling block or an obstacle or a hindrance. The implication is he's referring to sensual indulgence. Sex in particular, I suppose, but also just sensuality in general. It's like sex and food and intoxicants and music and just all this sensual pleasures as like enjoyed by lay people, but monks are supposed to avoid. That a monk who says that when the Buddha said that they were obstacles, they're not really obstacles, that would be a serious case of misrepresenting the Buddha. And you're supposed to say it is not good to misrepresent the Buddha. When you're admonishing him, you're supposed to point out to him that misrepresenting the Buddha is a grave offense. So, aside from that, there's 2 rules. One is for a monk who does it, and one is for a novice who does it. And the novice who does it, he's just supposed to be kicked out. You're not supposed to have anything to do with him if he keeps insisting that what the Buddha called a stumbling block really isn't a stumbling block, namely sensuality, sensual indulgence. But aside from that, I mean, in a way, starting a schism would be kind of misrepresenting the Buddha, Dhamma, and or Sangha, because you'd have to have some kind of reason for going your own way. Somewhat, you'd be deviating from orthodoxy somehow. And that's serious. You can go to hell for that, starting a schism. It is kind of ironic to me that in Mahayana, they emphasize, possibly more than in Theravada, the severity of like slandering Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, whereas from the Theravadan point of view, that's what Mahayana Buddhists are doing. That some teachings, not all teachings of Mahayana, some teachings of Mahayana really go contrary to what the Buddha says in the oldest texts. So presumably somebody along the line started misrepresenting or slandering the Buddha anyway, or what the Buddha said. So let's see. What exactly is the question here? The overall concept, what constitutes as slandering the Buddha? Misrepresenting the Buddha. I mean, especially if you're doing it on purpose. I mean, if you're doing it ignorantly, like you sincerely think the Buddha taught something, and you just found this bogus quote on the internet that really wasn't by the Buddha, and they're easy to find. it's really easy to find just bogus quotes from the Buddha. Then, I mean, if you're deliberately misrepresenting the Buddha, then that would be fairly serious offense. And going with Orthodox tradition, you could wind up in hell for such a thing. But I think like just the ordinary, like a Pure Land Buddhist or some such, who is following teachings that really the historical Gautama Buddha probably would not have endorsed, then, I mean, they're doing it sincerely. They consider it to be genuine Buddhism and so forth. And so, they might not be doing anything particularly wrong. Although whoever came up with this stuff may, I mean, if the texts are correct, then yeah, they might be in a bad place right now. So, yeah, the Theravada tradition's stance on slandering the triple jewel, including its penalties. Yeah, I mean, you could go to hell, and hell is very nasty and lasts a long time. It doesn't last forever in Buddhism, but it can last millions of years, just being tortured by demons or something. But you'd have to have really bad mental states, really bad intentions. Like you're deliberately trying to lead people away from genuine Dharma, so in order to keep them stuck in samsara. And let's say you experience some success at doing this, then yeah, that would be serious, and you could theoretically go to hell for that. Maybe even Avicii hell, which is the lowest, baddest one. But yeah, I'm really no authority, and the Pali texts really do not put a lot of emphasis on that kind of thing. It is true that the Buddha said that the Ajivakas, who are a non-Buddhist spiritual philosophical sect, that believing the stuff they believed, which was strict determinism, that you could go to hell for that. Also, I mean, the Ajivakas would literally torture themselves as a way of like burning off their bad karma, which according to the Buddha didn't work, and it just causes more harm than good. So if an Ajivaka monk, even a sincere devout one, can go to hell just for believing really wrong stuff, then yeah, I suppose some Buddhist who is deliberately misrepresenting what the Buddha taught, or in some cases maybe even sincerely representing, he believes that it's true, still, I mean, you can wind up getting bad karma for yourself. And it's going to depend on how outrageously bad your mental states were to determine what the punishment would be, because there is no, if you do this, then this bad thing is going to happen to you in your next life. And if you do this other thing, then the penalty is you get reincarnated as a centipede 17 times or something. It doesn't work that way. It depends on your own mental states. Ethics are a matter of psychology rather than any kind of divine retribution. So I guess I answered that question. And considering that we've been going for more than 3 hours, I think I need to move on to the next one, although we are getting close to the end. There is that. And that's kind of good because I'm starting to get a little bit hoarse. Not that I'm complaining. These questions need to be answered. And by golly, I'm answering them. So, I have a theory. This is Robin's Nest again saying, I have a theory that I'd like your opinion on. It seems to me that the Theravada tradition, like all other Buddhist schools, has aspects it excels in and other areas that could use improvement. Based on reading Theravada literature, I'm of the opinion that perhaps at some point there were more scriptures in the Tripitaka that were later taken out, perhaps during a conservative reformation. This would explain a lot, in my opinion. Do you think this is possible? If so, please share your thoughts on this idea. Well, just about anything is possible, although I don't think it's very likely. I think it's more the other way. I mean, it is true, the Buddha, no doubt, gave lots and lots of sermons that never got recorded, never got memorized, and are lost. Most of what the Buddha said is lost now. But I do think the original Tipitaka was probably smaller than it is now. There's more evidence of stuff being added to it than stuff being deleted from it. There are some cases, like the Sarvastivada Tripitaka, that it's missing like the Jivaka Sutta that is found in the Pali Majjhima Nikaya, because in the Pali Majjhima Nikaya, the Buddha is saying it's okay for monks to eat meat. And the Sarvastivada Buddhists were vegetarian, and so probably they removed that one. I mean, it wasn't the whole purpose of the sutta, wasn't the Buddha just justifying the eating of meat. It was like Jivaka, the doctor, who is the Buddha's personal physician, comes to the Buddha and says that some other groups are saying that the Buddhists encourage killing because the monks eat meat. And then the Buddha says, no, it's like if a monk sees, hears, or suspects that an animal was killed for his sake, he's not allowed to eat it. But if it's already dead, then it's okay. And that text is found in the Pali text, but not in the Sarvastivadin, like hybrid Sanskrit texts. So, I mean, it is possible that the Theravada Buddhists just cooked up a new one, but it's also possible that the Sarvastivada Buddhists just didn't like that one because it went against a later development in Buddhism, which is vegetarianism, because the earliest Buddhists were not vegetarian. Or some of them were, but it was optional. You were not required to be a vegetarian if you were a Buddhist monk in very early times. But I think I've digressed a bit. Let's see. I'm of the opinion that perhaps at some point there were more scriptures in the Tipitaka that were later taken out. Yeah, it's not very likely that very many texts would be removed, because there would obviously be protests against taking out texts that were already well known to be Buddha Vachana, or the teachings of Buddha. So you can add new ones easier than you can take out old, well-known ones, which explains why there are some old texts that really are not orthodox. They're more of an embarrassment, or it's more of a problem of having it. It's like there's no way they would have added this stuff. Like the Atthaka Vagga of the Sutta Nipata is considered to be one of the oldest ancient texts in Buddhism. One of the most important texts in Buddhism, just because it's so old. And a lot of it is just not orthodox. It's pre-orthodox. It's pre-Theravadan. And so, I mean, I'm sure a lot of monks, Theravada monks, would have been happier just like editing that out, because it's really hard to explain in any kind of orthodox manner. So it is easier to add new texts, and lots of texts obviously are later additions than it is to like edit out or remove older texts. So, I mean, there may be some texts that are lost. I mean, back in the old days, most of the texts weren't even written down. They were just memorized by heart. And there was a time right before the Fourth Council when there was only one monk left alive who had memorized the entire Nidesa, which is a very obscure Pali text found in the Sutta Pitaka that pretty much nobody reads. So it wouldn't have been a great loss. In fact, it's like it contains the canonical commentary to the Atthaka Vagga, which is trying to explain away why the Atthaka Vagga is so unorthodox. So, I mean, it could be that there were certain texts that were even more obscure, less well-known, and the monks they just died out. That happened in Jainism a couple times, where, again, the Jains didn't write down their scriptures. They just memorized them. And they were more ascetic than the Buddhists. There were less scholar Jains, and eventually a lot of the texts were just lost because there were no monks left who had memorized all of it. So that could have happened in Buddhism also, but it would, in all likelihood, be the more obscure texts and not really the important suttas, that kind of thing. So I guess I answered that question, and so I'm going to move on to Robin's Nest's next question here. In Mahayana and Vajrayana, there is veneration to a vast multitude of deities. Additionally, it's quite common for indigenous deities to become integrated in whatever region Buddhism is generally practiced in. Many Hindu deities, though their backgrounds are often different, are also mutually worshipped While in Burma, what deities, if any, are venerated in addition to the Buddha? Well, the Burmese, before they converted to Buddhism, they followed what's called the Nat cult. And it was this strange kind of polytheism that venerated mainly the Nats were human beings who died. They were like magnanimous human beings, brave, noble-spirited humans who died a violent death. And the Burmese think that if you die a violent death, it makes you a more powerful ghost afterwards. And such a powerful ghost that they actually became like small g gods. And they are still venerated to some degree in Burma. Like if you're traveling through a part of Burma that is like presided over by Lord of the White Horse or some such, then sometimes, there's certain taboos and things you have to be careful about. I remember one time I was traveling through Mahamyain Forest, like very early on in like the early 90s, shortly after I got to Burma. And there was actually a shrine. It was just this dirt road going through this forest. There were a few times when the men had to get out of this bus and pull the bus with ropes through the sand because the road was just gone. But anyways, at one point, we were in this forest and we stopped at this shrine. And the shrine was to Baitano Me. It was this Burmese deity called Baitano Me, which literally means Black Vishnu. So, Vishnu is a Hindu god, and there were people that cared enough about Vishnu that they actually made a shrine, and people had been making offerings to this shrine. Vishnu, there's like a proto-Vishnu that's mentioned, like in the Jaga Sutta in Pali. Isana or something like that, I think was like an early version of Vishnu that existed, back towards the Buddhist time. But this is just like straight out of Hinduism. Baitano is Burmese way of saying Vishnu. So let's see. What deities are venerated in addition to the Buddha? Well, there's Saka, king of gods, who got incorporated into the Nat cult. He was incorporated when the Burmese converted to Buddhism. They still had their Nat cult. And then Saka, king of gods, was like incorporated into the Nat cult, and he became the king of these Nats. So that happened too. Lots of minor deities. I remember one time I spent a few years living out in this forest area, a very remote area. And I remember the first time I walked by there, it was all empty fields, just fields for growing rice and whatever. But there was this grove of trees just right at the edge of the field, not far from the villages. And I was wondering, why didn't they cut those down when they cut all the rest of the trees down? And it turned out that was a sacred grove dedicated to this goddess called, what was her name? Ameji. Yeah, Ameji, which means great mother. And there was this little shrine of this woman dressed in like traditional Burmese clothes with her hair up in a bun, and she had a sword, and there was like this tiger standing next, or like sitting up next to her. And people would go and make offerings to her. So, it's common in Thailand also, where you've just got these local deities or like pre-Buddhist deities that exist that still, if you're on their territory, you got to follow the rules, and, you may not be able to spit on the ground there because it's taboo or whatever. So it does happen, although nobody really is at the same level as the Buddha. The Buddha is number one. And somebody even like Saka, king of gods, or Black Vishnu or whatever, they're relatively minor deities that don't receive nearly the veneration as the Buddha himself, or for that matter, as much veneration as living monks. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is the last question. By golly, we are at the end. This is the last question after only 3 hours and 23 minutes. So, and this is from Pseudonym, and he asked this question shortly before I started doing the Q&A. And he says, how might you guide a layperson with regard to the right intention of renunciation while also pursuing a career, maintaining a fruitful marriage, raising children, and generally being engaged in the world. To put it differently, aside from the all-in choice to wear robes and live according to Vinaya, how might a layperson apply right intention of renunciation? And with all due respect to pseudonym, when I was a monk, this kind of question used to really get me sometimes. It was like I'm at a Dhamma hall answering questions, and somebody asked, essentially, how, as a Western lay Buddhist, can I practice renunciation correctly while not actually renouncing anything? Also, I was told that the Dalai Lama himself, the Dalai Lama, was asked this question once, essentially the same question is, how can a Western Buddhist who enjoys pleasures of the senses practice renunciation correctly? And he actually started crying, according to this person who was there, who saw it happen. So, he was probably asked that question way more than me. Technically, the correct answer is, you just don't practice renunciation if you're living in the world and raising a family and, et cetera, et cetera. That nekama, or renunciation, is the third of the 10 paramis. See, yeah, a third of the 10 paramis. And in the text, it just means renouncing the world. You practice nekama by, selling all that you have, giving the money to the poor, and going off into the forest. But I don't want to be too much of a hard ass. If a layperson who wants to be as renounced as possible, who wants to be at least a little bit of a renunciate, then, just simplify your life. You don't have to wallow in all the pleasures. If you're married or you got kids, the wife and kids might insist on having that television or whatever, but to the extent that you're able to, you simplify life and try to be a little more austere. And that would be like a partial renunciation. It wouldn't be like considered by tradition to be a correct or enough of a renunciation, but still, it's kind of baby steps in the right direction of, whatever certain things that you like, you just don't go there, just kind of self-restraint, simplification of your existence. You would know better than I do, what steps to take in order to go in that direction to make your life simpler and more austere. Because that's like the main point of renunciation, is to renounce all these things that are distractions that keep you stuck in samsara. So rather than renounce all of them, you can renounce, just renouncing one of them is better than nothing, whatever it is. So, I guess I answered that question. And that means that I answered all them their questions. And so, you know the drills. Like, if you got any questions you think I can answer, feel free to leave them in the comments below, or you can save them in the hopes that I actually will be able to do a live stream at noon next Sunday, Eastern time, American Eastern time. And then you can just save the questions there. And if I get more questions than I got this time, man, I'm going to be going for a long time. But that's okay, I guess. So like and subscribe if you have not done so already, and be happy.